Jiang Kai fell into the water and asked whether to believe in fate. He sank lower and lower, blue lines flew around him, and he continued, should he believe that fate presents different results? Depending on the choice, or can one believe that despite the choice the ending will be the same? A bright light hit him, and he found himself on the ground where the Lord of the Beasts was attacking ordinary people who shouted help. The guy ran through the desert with tears in his eyes, shouting that human-like monsters were too dangerous. Others shouted to the monster not to come closer. People suddenly found themselves on a high mountain and shouted, "Cliff! Nowhere to run! We need to hide quickly!" The master of the beast stood, looked around, and people sat behind the rocks in the hope of hiding from the monster. The girl sat, cried, and thought that if only the master of the beasts would not notice. She asks, "Just not this, let him not come here," and a tear rolled down her cheek. Suddenly a monster appeared, everything in her eyes turned pale, and she screamed, "No!" She asks. But this did not stop the master of the beasts. He grabbed her and began to growl. At this moment, Jiang Kai was sitting behind a rock, trembling and thinking about what it means. Is this the Devil's Star? The test is too difficult for beginners. According to the condition of completing the task to change classes, you need to last 5 minutes on the Devil's Star, but for an ordinary person, he won't last here even a minute. Jiang Kai is currently undergoing a rookie mission on the planet Devil Star. Devil Star is a huge planet not far from the Earth that appeared out of nowhere 50 years ago. Its appearance did not cause any gravitational collapse and did not affect the Earth, but because with its appearance, plants and animals suddenly evolved into divine beasts, chaos reigned throughout the planet. Modern technologies cannot do anything to oppose these creatures. Because of them, people were on the verge of extinction, but in a moment of complete despair, many portals appeared on the Earth. Passing through them, people ended up on the Devil's Star in the form of digital copies. At the moment of their arrival, we understood that this place is a highly realistic simulation. Here you can get a variety of professions. Each of them has its own characteristics, equipment, and skills. People can level up like game characters and become stronger. Once it was even discovered that having reached a certain level on the Devil, you can return to Earth with these powers. At this level, people will be able to fight off beasts and reclaim the Earth. If humanity wants to live in their homeland, they must get as much as possible from the Devil. People who decided to go to the star began to be called pioneers. At that moment, the monster struck. Kai looked from behind the rock and said that it was bad. Only he survived, but he had nowhere to run. The monster began to approach him, and Kai looked into the distance and thought that he really spent all his family's savings just to die in such a place. He remembered his brother and sister, who said that if he wanted, he would go to the star. He and his brother will try to save him money for this. Kai's younger sister went through so many difficulties to save this money. His brother continued to work hard, ignoring the diagnosis of kidney failure. If he did not get ready for surgery within 2 months, Kai closed his eyes and thought that he would die here, even without getting a profession and spend all their money on it. Suddenly the monster pointed his dagger at Kai with all his might. He saw this, got scared and shouted, "No! Rather than wait here to die, it's better to take risks for the sake of your family." He took off and quickly ran somewhere. A bright light filled everything around. A blow struck him on the shoulder, and he thought that he would grab any chance. Suddenly he sharply began to fall down from the cliff. The monster looked at him, and Kai clenched his teeth tightly and looked up. Suddenly a bright blue light appeared. The system reported that his actions fit gambler. He was congratulated. He got a chance of 1 million and opened a hidden profession. Then the system reported that it was a hidden profession. He had completed the quest to change professions. They hoped he could glorify himself as its user. There were cubes in the hands of the skeleton, and a gambler was written on a blue background. Kai fell to the ground. He felt a little unpleasant, but then he looked up questioningly, stood up and asked what was happening. No pain after falling off a cliff? And all the wounds received before have healed? Suddenly a bright blue light appeared in front of him. He looked questioningly, and saw the artificial intelligence of the Devil's Star. Artificial intelligence reported that after changing professions, its characteristics were updated. This is tantamount to rebirth. Kai looked at the artificial intelligence in surprise, and she said that she congratulated him on his successful change of profession. Now she will explain to him what talents he received as a gambler. The system reports that talent is a multiplier. All rewards and punishments issued by the system are doubled. In addition, there is a 1% chance to activate a super multiplier. Its effect multiplies rewards and punishments tenfold. The system said that during the activation of professions the talent multiplier worked, so he received another gambler talent. The system reported that the talent was working. Kai was delighted and asked what? Another talent of the profession, while others receive only one. The artificial intelligence said correctly. His next talent is as follows. The system said that his next talent is Super Crit. The crystal level from his attacks will increase to 2000%. Initially, the chance of a critical level is 0.1%. The system reported Pioneer Jiang Kai, Profession Gambler, Level 1, Characteristic Strength 4, Endurance 8, Agility 12, Intelligence 12, Defense 0, Experience 0 out of 100, Talent Multiplier, Super Crit. Kai looked in surprise, asking for a total of 36 stat points. Regular players only get 20 after changing professions. Where did he get 36? Intelligence reported that his scores were also doubled after changing professions. Kai asked, "Is it even possible to multiply?" And then I thought about what it means for each new level he will receive 20 points instead of 10. Doesn't this mean that he will grow twice as fast as others? Kai smiled, leafed through the system and thought that he also had extra crit. Other players have a critical level of only 200%, but he has as much as 20,000%. Even if his chance is only 0.1%, he will be able to rise and then his level will be simply abnormal. Kai went further, saw something in the distance, and thought that this was the weapon that creature used. There was a monster staff in front of him. He was thinking that he only planned to quickly change his profession after arriving in this place and earn money for his brother. Even the weakest profession on the Devil Star can earn a lot. But he could not imagine that he would receive a hidden and such a strong profession. At that moment, he pulled out the monster's weapon, took it in his hands and thought that soon he would be able to save money and his family's life would improve. But this is just the beginning, he needs more. The system appeared and reported that he had completed the task of changing professions, completing the quest, reaching the city of the gods safe and sound. A huge map appeared in front of him and showed him where to move, and he was thinking about completing the training zone quest. A bright yellow arrow appeared in front of him. He thought that the main goal was to get to the city of the gods in 7 days. It was extremely difficult to get there in one piece. The beginner zone was overflowing with monsters. If he died, the quest would fail, and the player would be teleported back to Earth. It was already getting dark outside. He stood, looked into the distance, thinking that the body on Earth would not suffer in any way, even if it died in this world. After that it would be possible to get here again. But this little problem is only for the rich. Rebooting your profile in the Devil's Star costs a fortune. The rich are not limited in their attempts, but the poor are completely obliged to pass it on the first try. Suddenly Kai got scared. A forest appeared in front of him from which terrible screams could be heard. He hid behind a tree and thought that this was a familiar scream. Really? He didn't finish speaking when a monster in the form of a snake appeared in front of him. Yuan Zhu screamed in fear, cried and said that the Lord would save him. Zhu was scared. With the help of his strength he drove away the snakes, shouting for them to leave. He hates snakes. Yuan Zhu, Jiang Kai's childhood friend. Kai looked at him and thought that it was true. Zhu. He's trapped by snakes. Their poison is extremely strong. Even human-like beasts will die from one bite. Zhu is in danger. Kai shouted to him not to be afraid. Kai is here. Kai ran and began to attack with his weapon, protecting his friend. Zhu turned around sharply and asked Kai, "Why is he here?" Zhu shouted at him to forget and leave. Snakes have a very high characteristic, and they are also poisonous. They don't stand a chance. Kai ran, and lightning flashed around him. He shouted that Zhu should not worry. Zhu was very surprised at that moment. He saw how Kai killed the snake and asked, "What? Can he kill them?" Kai at that moment ran towards the snakes and thought that great, Zhu distracts them well, so he can attack from the blind spot. But now they're targeting Kai. Zhu got scared and shouted at him to run. They have high agility. Kai dodged them and asked, "Really?" Zhu at that moment was terribly shocked and asked, "What? Can he avoid this?" At that moment, Kai landed on the ground without a single scratch, looked at Zhu and thought that his statistics were twice as high and equal to the second level. Kai thought that first-level snakes were no match for him. Kai grabbed his weapon and spoke further, shouting at Zhu to continue to provoke the snakes towards himself. Zhu ran up, began to use his strength and shouted, "Okay." Bright blue lightning appeared around. The remains of snakes lay on the ground. Zhu looked at Kai, who easily fought off the snakes and said this. He only distracted them for a minute, and Kai really killed everyone. Kai, after dealing with the snakes, opened the system and thought that his profession has high agility, but little strength. But the damage is enough to kill first-level monsters with one blow. This iron spear will perfectly help him increase his strength for a while. Strength is the basic characteristic responsible for attacking a star. Zhu ran up and began to hug Kai and shouted that he had only heard that newcomers died at the hands of monsters, but not the other way around. How could he? Zhu hugged Kai so tightly that he coughed, walked away from Zhu and said that he was lucky, he got the profession of a gambler, but he should not dare tell anyone about it. Zhu asked the gambler in surprise. Then he flexed his muscles, winked and said that he didn't know how it was with him, but his profession was very good. Zhu showed his system where it was written that he was a martial arts master. Kai asked the martial artist in surprise. Now it's clear how he held out against the three snakes. She is in 5th place in the kingdom of the gods. How many professions are there in the devil's land? No one knows, but the first thing people do when they get here is to get a profession. Which one they get depends on the quality of the material they have before entering. The rich spend tens of millions of material for themselves, and so they get very strong professions after getting here. For example, warrior, knight, killer. The poor cannot afford good materials to obtain professions, so they are weak. Professions are given randomly. Kai stood against the backdrop of sunset in the middle of the forest and said that the profession of a martial artist costs at least 50 million. Did he take a loan? Zhu grinned and said no. The story is long, he will tell him later. Then Kai answered yes? Well, then they need to collect materials from the snakes, as he knows they can be sold. The money earned here can be exchanged for the Earth's currency. This will help Kai and the family. For example, they collect remains, cores, minerals, equipment, materials. Kai began to approach the snakes, and thought that speaking of the Devil Star items, like remains and equipment, after receiving, they turn into cards that can be transferred and sold. The system informed him that the remains of an island snake had been received and could be disassembled. Kai looked at the system and thought that judging by the battle, a gambling gambler is stronger than a martial artist. At that moment Zhu heard something in the bushes and Su came out to meet them and greeted them. Zhu got scared and hid behind Kai, and Kai irritably asked who is there. Su Nuenuan came out of the bushes, introduced herself and said that she couldn't pass the tests on her own. Could she join their team? Zhu began wiping his sweat, breathing heavily and talking about how this was just a pioneer. Kai at that moment looked at her and said that she should apologize, but it was difficult for them themselves. With her it would only be more difficult. Su ran to Kai and told them not to leave her. She was a healer, she could heal their wounds. She can also extract poison from snakes and improve their weapons, if they can find any. She asks you not to leave her. Zhu looked at her with burning eyes and said that she knew how to heal and buff. How cool! And Kai stood and thought that a healer is one of the 10 valuable professions. In this test it would be nice to have a healer. If he had not pulled away then, he would have already died. Kai looked at Su and said that okay, his name is Jiang Kai, and this is Yuan Zhu, they will get to the final destination together. Su shook his hand and said thank you to them. At that moment Zhu began to whisper in his ear that Kai really liked it and changed his mind. Kai replied that he would hit Zhu now. At the same time, the Kingdom of the Gods, Jianzhong City, Devil Star Portal, Base 18. At that moment, in the Data Research Laboratory, the professor was sitting at the computer and talking about how a wristwatch is a great invention. It can accurately determine the location of pioneers on a star. At this moment, Su Lanlan entered the office, saying that of course, most watches on the market easily give out all kinds of devil data, and the more expensive the watch, the more functions it has. Then she asked the professor how are you doing? Is her little sister okay? Su Lanlan was the rookie test inspector. The professor replied that judging by the GPS data, most of the newcomers have already been eliminated, and her sister is now on a team with 2 people. Lanlan asked furiously what? Did you look at the professor and scream about being so cowardly that you joined a team with others? She told her not to let Su join the team. After all, the more newcomers gather in one place. At that moment, a huge monster appeared in the forest overhead. The more newcomers gather in one place, the more monsters they attract. Several monsters immediately surrounded Shu, Kai and Su. They were ready to fight. 3 minutes later, the professor was sitting at the computer and talking about the fact that there were indeed 2 human-like monsters next to Su. Lanlan was shaking and said that even one was too much for a group of beginners. And against 2, Su has no chance. Lanlan thought that death on the star is the same as losing a character in the game. Their body on Earth will not be damaged, but the psychological trauma from the experience can cause serious harm. Thus people simply went crazy and shouted for them to watch as the monster tore piece after piece from them. Someone shouted monster, monster. Lanlan turned around sharply, ran and shouted that she would take her sister for psychological tests. The professor told her to wait, she wasn't dead yet. Lon Lon turned around and asked what? The professor replied that 2 people were similar monsters, they died. All the people were shocked, asking what happened? 3 minutes ago, Luda-like monsters were running towards the group. Shu was shouting about what kind of nonsense is this. Su ran as fast as she could, screaming that, apparently, this was a human-like beast. We need to run faster. At that moment Kai ran forward, looked at his comrades and thought about how bad it was. They are not so agile, Zhu and Su get blown out. He stopped abruptly and shouted for Zhu to go first. Zhu began to shout Kai with tears in his eyes. He replied that they should run. He'll figure it out on his own. Standing opposite the monsters, he thought that if this continued, everyone would die together. He would stay and kill these animals. He flew up high and, with the help of his spear, struck the monster, shouting that he had hit it. But suddenly his eyes widened in surprise. The monster threw him into a rock. Kai sat and thought about how terrible it was. How much health he has that couldn't be achieved with one hit. The monsters were reaching out to him. Kai looked into their eyes and thought that he would really die in the test for beginners. Apparently this was the end. Su looked at Kai with tears in her eyes and said that he was in danger. They needed to save him. Ju was scared at that moment. He was breathing heavily and talking about what he was doing. At this moment, a residential area near a polluted river, a woman was carrying coffee and asking that this man was the one who gave Zhu the materials for work. I'm not sure how they evaluate him, but her son, although tall, is very timid. If they meet a monster, he will hardly dare to fight. The man sat on the sofa, drank coffee and said that it was true that her child was very afraid of monsters, but he realized that Zhu would not leave anyone in trouble in such a situation. He would not. Zhu at that moment gathered all his strength, shouted and began to attack the monsters, removing them with an attack, telling him that he decided to protect him because he was weak. At that moment Kai looked in fear and shouted to Zhu, and Zhu said that they were brothers. Brothers must fight together. And die. At that moment, Kai stood up, looked at Zhu, who ran up to strike, and shouted that he would also die together. Kai covered his face from the bright light, and thought that Zhu could finish off the monster with horror alone. Even if the damage is small, can a martial artist do this? Suddenly a green light and pluses appeared around Kai. He looked questioningly, and Su used her power to heal him and shouted for him to hold on. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she forgot in this place. She's not a fighter. Su screamed that she would not leave. A doctor must treat people, despite any fear. She recalled that her father lost the support of healers during the invasion of monsters and died for it. Su started crying and screamed that when her team needed support, could she leave it? Kai looked at her in surprise. His health had increased by 100%, and he thought that his wound was healing. He smiled and said, well, she really is not afraid of death. Su looked at Kai and Zhu, thinking that even together they would not have enough damage to kill such a beast. Kai sharply shouted stop. He remembered the words Su said that if they meet the same ones, she will be able to extract the poison and strengthen their weapons. Kai opened the system and shouted that it can extract poison? Su shouted yes. Kai took out a snake, held it out, and said that he could treat Zhu and extract the poison at the same time? Su got down to business, was worried and shouted that she was not sure, but she would try. Kai looked at his spear, which had poison on it, and thought that if he guessed correctly, they could win. Now he cannot stand alone with this creature, but Zhu can. Kai thought that his damage was not enough to kill the beast, but the improvement from Su, if you look closely, their team is an excellent example from the games, a combination of a tank, damage dealer and healer. Su shouted that the poison application was completed. Kai ran up, holding a spear in his hand, thinking that what difference does it make whether he is a beginner or not? Then Zhu shouted to hold the beast for him. Zhu tried hard to defeat the monster, and shouted without any problems. Now they are working as a team and fulfilling their roles. Kai took a running start, pushed off the ground, and started aiming straight at the monster, thinking that even if someone found out that some newcomers like them had beaten a Ludo of such a beast, they would be able to come and challenge them. Kai thrust his spear into the monster. A bright explosion occurred in a circle. The system reported that a Ludo-like beast of the second level had been killed. 5 out of 100 experience had been gained. Kai looked and smiled, and Zhu was terribly surprised. Su looked with admiring eyes and said that it worked. After the team killed all the monsters, another one appeared, and the team stood opposite the monster, and he thought that working as a team really helped. Another one came out. The monster ran at them, and Kai shouted that they would defeat him too. All the team members began to perform their duties, and at this time the professor and Lan Lan stood in front of the screen and she asked for a wristwatch. They were able to kill 2 animals? How did the 3 of them cope with someone who could single-handedly kill even a much larger group? The professor looked at the screen seriously and answered, and it's true, from Sue's watch it can't be said that she has enough strength. The pioneers in her team are also not strong enough. Jiang Kai stands out. His profession was not found in the system. A system with Kai's photo appeared on the screen, where his profession was not shown. Lan Lan screamed in surprise, not found? Is this even possible? She thought about the power to kill 2 similar people, but the profession is unknown? This newcomer, what kind of character is he? At this time, in the thicket of the forest, Kai picked up the body of Ludo-like beasts. The team lay on the floor, laughed, and said that they had done it. No one expected Kai to be so smart. Sue looked at her team and joyfully shouted that since they had enough strength to do this, they would pass the test without any problems. Zhu replied that yes, they need to go to the very end right away. Kai got up from the ground, smiled, and said that there was no need to rush. There was still enough time to reach Shangxi before the pace slowed down a little. Sue and Zhu looked at him in surprise and did not understand why he was saying that, and Kai said that they know that after the test they give points. The first 3 in the top will be rewarded with equipment. The equipment received after training is very good for beginners. Kai opened the system and said that since they can kill animals, they can get points from their corpses, and with more points they can qualify for the top 3. Then he looked at the team and asked why not kill monsters for points and equipment first? The team was very surprised. A few hours later, when it was already dark, Shu held a stick in his hand and shouted to Kai that he really thought it was worth earning points like this. Even though he asks to lure the snakes, Zhu is afraid. Shu began to be surrounded by snakes. He asked with tears in his eyes, will he die first? Kai sat on a tree and told him to be braver. He is a martial arts master, he was created to be a tank and a damage dealer, and besides, Su can always heal them. Kai began to talk about how he would die. At that moment the snakes flew at Shu, and Kai began to fight off the snakes and said that it would not be so easy. He killed 3 snakes, and the experience gained was 10 out of 100. He was surrounded by snakes. He was ready to fight and thought that on the star there is a rule that the one who kills gets experience, and since he is the only one who is able to kill, they decided that Kai would be the first to get experience. Kai began to fight with the snakes, easily fighting them off with the help of his weapon. At that moment he thought that this way he would ensure the safety of his team. A day later Kai, Zhu and Su stood in the night forest around the dead snakes. The system informed Kai that it congratulated the player on achieving experience 100 out of 100. His level was increased to 2, the multiplier effect also worked, so he gets double points. Kai looked at his system and said great. With just 1 kill of land snakes, he rose to level 2. Su shouted to Kai that they were congratulating him on leveling up. Shu asked if Kai was already feeling better. Kai smiled and said that after the increase, he gained 20 stat points. Now after the level increase he has 56. Su and Zhu were terribly surprised and asked how much? Zhu shouted with tears in his eyes, what? But they usually give 10 points, how did he get 20? Zhu only has 26 stat points. Su at this moment was talking about the fact that, moreover, at the second level there are 56 points. It seems that after that he is no longer lagging behind the level. Wow! Su only has 12 stat points. Kai explained that it's all thanks to his special profession. The rewards are doubled, but the punishments are also doubled, so he can't make mistakes. Su was surprised and shouted despite the fact that she did not fully understand his profession. His profession is very cool. Shu at this moment was dissatisfied, kicked the snakes and said that he was a much cooler martial artist. At that moment, a window appeared, an artificial intelligence came out of it, which said that since the player had reached the second level, he was entitled to 1 new skill, but since he had a talent multiplier, his skill doubled. Kai was surprised and asked if he could get a new skill at the second level. Moreover, would he get 2 at once? Zhu was angry and asked, is he capable of this? And Su looked in surprise and said great. The artificial intelligence said that yes, he is granted the skill of a card in the ghost's hand. A card in the ghost's hand when throwing objects, the flight power increases by 20%. When he uses cards other than the same card, the effect of the action increases by 200%, but energy consumption also increases by 100%, while skills can be improved. The second skill acquired is focusing the ghost's eye. Its viewing range is increased by 50%, energy consumption is increased by 100%, and skills can be improved. Kai asked in surprise, it turns out 2 new skills at once? Even though he doesn't fully understand them yet, they seem to be very useful in his profession. Then he turned to his team and said that okay, he has become stronger, so they can go on earning experience points. Su was happy and shouted yes. And Ju was unhappy and asked why Kai. 2 days later, Lamon was standing in front of the screen. The professor came up to her and said that 2 days had passed, but surprisingly, nothing bad was happening to her sister. She asked, really? The new guy is tenacious. I think his name is Jiang Kai. Suddenly a soldier ran into the room and shouted that there was an urgent announcement. Danger has been detected in newcomer territory. Asks everyone to gather. People looked in surprise and did not understand what was happening. Wang entered the laboratory and began shouting that the enemy country had sent its people to the newcomer zone. An invasion was expected. Everyone needs to get ready. This was all said by Commander-in-Chief Wang. Lamon was scared and asked, is it true about a large-scale invasion? Ing replied that if it were a lie, he would not have come here. Lamon was terrified. She was enveloped in panic. She thought that they would be attacked by stowaways. This is a special profession of the enemy country. They specialize in killing newcomers. They can only stand outside the territory and wish the newcomers good luck. Lamon thought that advanced players cannot and should not enter the beginner's zone, so as not to hinder their development, but the country's free riders are different from others. They have special skills that allow them to penetrate the territory of another state. Moreover, they use very cruel methods of murder. Beginners in tears and panic asked that they didn't do it. Their goal is to make beginners afraid of the Devil's Star, increasing the chances of other players to succeed. Most often, newcomers then go crazy and say that it is better to kill them, but they will never return there. Lanlan was terribly angry, hit the table with her fists, screamed and worried about her sister, saying that she was too weak if these animals attacked. But then Ning interrupted her and said that it was necessary to prepare newcomers. A large-scale attack by the army of free riders had already begun, therefore, they must prepare for the fact that none of them will survive. The team was walking through the night forest. Suddenly Kai quickly turned around and asked there? Shu asked in surprise what was the matter. Kai swung his weapon and said that there was something there. Su and Zhu looked in surprise and talked about what he was doing. They needed to go. There was nothing there. Kai used his skill of focusing the ghost eye and said that no, a little further. He threw the weapon with all his might and said that there was something. There was a strong blow. They saw it and quickly ran. Kai shouted about what happened. Forward. At that moment the guys looked in surprise and did not understand. Shu said that there was nothing there. What kind of vision did he have? They ran to the river, stood in front of a huge boar. The system reported that the pioneer Jiang Kai killed a second-level wild boar. The current scores are 199 out of 200. Shu asked in surprise that he had such a keen eye? How did he notice the wild boar in such a distance? Su covered her mouth with her hand and said and killed him. Kai began to take out his weapon and replied that there was nothing surprising in this. It was all thanks to his new skills. The system asked if he wanted to get the corpse of a wild boar. A wild boar carcass with sharp spikes X19. The spikes can be used for weapons. He answered yes, and then he thought that the current skill card in the ghost's hand increased his damage. Thanks to the focusing of the ghost's eye, his vision became better. Now he can follow the attacks. In other words, the enemy will not even notice him. Okay, he's only 1 point short of level 3. Kai turned to the others and said that they needed to kill some monster. Su agreed with this, and Zhu said sadly that he was still at the first level. Suddenly someone appeared in the water. Loud laughter was heard and the words that the captain, the second team, was very lucky. Free riders began to appear from the water and say that now it's time for fun. Kai asked displeasedly who they are. The stowaway began to take out his sword and shout that he should not be afraid. They are not good people. They just want to tear out his chest and make him bleed, or skin him alive and then feed him to animals. Kai, Su and Zhu began to be surrounded by stowaways, and then the main one came out of the water and said that, in general, they had the same goal. At that moment, Kai looked at him questioningly, and the commander of the opposing team smiled broadly. He was a smuggler. The captain of the second team said that they had one goal, not to allow newcomers to pass the test. Su shouted to Kai in fear that these people, she knows them. They appear to be free riders who specialize in killing newbies. Kai and Zhu turned in surprise and asked what? Su looked at the opponents with the help of her watch, and said that they were all above the 3rd level. The highest level was 5th. Kai was angry and thought that there were a lot of people here. Was everyone really on the 5th level? Its current characteristics, at best, can compete with the 4th level, but not with the 5th. The commander of the second team shouted to the brothers not to stand. Kai started running and thinking about doing something. He shouted to Zhu and Su to stay together, he needed to separate from them. They shouted to him okay. The commander of the second team smiled and said that he had really only now decided to take action. Are they all that slow? The commander told his subordinates that 2 of them should go after Kai, while the rest would deal with his team for now. Kai was chased, he ran as fast as he could, and his opponents said that he was fast. But there is no escape from them. He suddenly disappeared, and the opponents were surprised and tried to find him, looking around. They laughed sarcastically and asked if the guy decided to play with them. Another replied that he was so excited. As soon as they find him, all his legs will be broken. A Kai weapon flew out of the bushes at each other. Did the enemy shout that he had decided to fight them? But garbage is no match for them. Suddenly the weapon pierced the villain's body, and he was thrown into a tree. The other villain looked in surprise and did not understand how this was possible. The opponent flew off into the distance with a bright light, and the other asked, "He's already flown, is everything okay?" His eyes opened wide in horror, and he asked, "Is he dead?" "How so?" Kai stood behind him, grinned and asked that do all free riders really die so easily? It looks like there is nothing to envy. At that moment he took out his spikes and began to attack his opponent. The villain opened the system and asked if he was a newbie. How did he manage to kill his 3rd level comrade? The system showed that the 2nd level, the probability of a critical hit is not clear, the strength of a critical hit is not clear. The opponent was shaking with fear and asking what? At the 3rd level, his attributes are only 45 units. Is Kai already 60? How is this possible? Sharp thorns flew into the opponent's body, and he fell to his knees and died. Kai stood in front of them and thought about what happened. In terms of general characteristics, it is not inferior to the 4th level, so we managed to figure it out with the 3rd. He suggested escaping in order to attract a small part of the free riders. It would be more convenient to kill. He remembered how he left the guys, and said that he had almost reached the 3rd level, if he kills the stowaway, then. But suddenly artificial intelligence appeared and said that he managed to kill the stowaway before the victim's body dissipates. Does he want to appropriate his experience to yourself? He can get up to 100 experience points, which will definitely not be superfluous to him. Kai was delighted and shouted, "Of course! It turns out that you can get more experience for killing free riders? And you don't have to kill monsters? In that case, he needs all their experience points." The system responded well and congratulates him on reaching the 3rd level. Kai took all the opponent's points and said that finally the 3rd level. Now the total attribute score is 76 points, and the 5th level stowaway only has 60 points. Kai confidently walked and said that now, it's time to return and show them his strength. At this moment, Zhu and Su were sitting on the ground surrounded by stowaways, and they were talking about being a martial artist and a doctor. They laughed loudly and said that they didn't think they would stumble upon 2 of the best professions at once. The other guy smiled and said, "Good professions, it's time to torture them to death." Everyone prepared their weapons. Su said with tears in her eyes that 2 stowaways were chasing Kai. Will he be able to return? Zhu was bleeding and said definitely. There is no way he will give up so easily, especially when such a girl is nearby. And when Kai's friends and family are in danger, nothing matters. The commander-in-chief shouted, "The foreplay is over, go ahead." Kai got angry and shouted, "It's time to speak." He pointed his weapons at his opponent, and immediately killed half of them. Su screamed in surprise at these thorns, and Zhu smiled and said that he knew that he would return. The commander-in-chief of the opponents asked in fear who was there. "Someone snuck in here? Let him come out, they need to fight." The commander-in-chief looked around and said that he couldn't see. Where was he? Maybe some new profession has appeared. If this is so, he turned around and ran as fast as he could and shouted that he needed to run away. Zhu and Su stood up, looked in surprise and shouted, "The stowaway is running away." Kai was terribly angry at that moment, and was talking about how he wanted to leave after hurting his friend. His life belongs to him. The weapon flew at the commander-in-chief with all its force and pierced through him. He fell to the ground and died. Zhu and Su were sitting, and everyone around them was defeated. She turned around and saw who was asking the free riders over. "Su, is she okay?" She shouted to Kai that he was back. She ran up to him and said that Zhu was seriously injured and she couldn't help him. Zhu at that moment was sitting covered in blood and sadly saying that he knew that Kai would return, but he wouldn't go further with them. He couldn't do it anymore and fell to the ground. Zhu lay on the ground and told Kai that the adventures with them are his best memories. And now, let him take his share, they are trying hard to pass the tests. Su at this moment began to cry and scream heavily. "Friend Zhu," Kai said sadly to Zhu, and then took the stowaway, threw him on the body and shouted that maybe he'll get down to business. Everyone was very surprised. Kai said that he deliberately did not kill the stowaways so that someone could replenish their experience and recover. Su replied that, by the way, you can recover in the Devil Star by taking the experience of another player. Zhu got angry and displeasedly asked, "Is this also possible? In that case, he is saved." Kai said that he thought so, that he was pretending, and then he smiled broadly and joyfully and said that in any case, these stowaways were not going to leave him alive, were they? Therefore, he should not feel sorry for them either. Su and Zhu smiled maliciously and said that they wished him a good subsequent reincarnation. They wished him good luck. Kai, Su and Zhu looked like villains in their eyes who asked, "Isn't it cool? He will become their donor. Take advantage of his voluntary sacrifice." The enemy was sweating and screaming demons. "Don't let it fit." At the same time, the Department for Transporting Stowaways of the City of L, a research institute, the system reported a loss of signal. The drones woke up and shouted that they had been destroyed by some newcomer. "He's too cruel." They took all their experience points. The top of the city was screaming about, "What is this? What else is this? How could free riders suffer so much? Has a new profession emerged that can withstand free riders?" At the same time, in the kingdom of the gods, the professor stood in front of the tap and shouted about what was bad. Judging by the latest information, Su and her team have encountered stowaways. Lanon shouted, "What? Is it really Su?" At that moment Ing was drinking coffee and saying that not a single newcomer had ever managed to escape from a free rider. Let him prepare for her death. The professor smiled and said that no, he didn't think so. Su did not die during the battle with the stowaways. On the contrary, she increased her level. Ing and Lanon were very surprised. Ing asked how this could happen. How did he manage to increase his level when fighting with free riders? Maybe the stowaways helped him kill the monsters. The professor replied that no, Su could not reach a new level so quickly by killing a stowaway. She rose 2 levels, as they think is possible. Ing and Lanon asked in surprise, "Did she kill the stowaway?" At that moment, the glass fell to the floor. The commander-in-chief jumped up and began shouting to show him these commands quickly. The professor shouted to eat. He began to display the system on the screen. Ing looked seriously and saw 3 people, smiled broadly and said that they had reached the 3rd level. Without killing the stowaways, they wouldn't have been able to go up 2 levels in such a short time. Lanlan asked if this was possible. Su has no fighting ability. Maybe Jiang Kai has dealt with all the stowaways? But this is very strange. Ing smiled and said that his intuition told him that it was Kai's doing, and then asked, by the way, why his indicators were not determined. The professor replied that he had found information on this matter. All travelers are given special watches to determine information, but Kai's is the oldest. The server of this model stopped being serviced more than 10 years ago, and they are not connected to the internet, so their information is not available to them. Lanlan asked in surprise, "What? Has he been using an antique watch all these years?" Ing smiled and talked about what was interesting, and then shouted for real information about the indicators to be collected for him. Wants to see its characteristics. Everyone shouted good. Shu was happy and shouted about how cool it was. I didn't think that the entire volume of life would be restored. Su looked at her system in surprise, and was she really screaming too? Zhu shouted that moreover, he had obtained the professional skill of Earth Axe. Can hit enemies that are nearby. Su replied that she also received a new skill, namely the Healer's Benevolence. Now her abilities are improving. Kai replied that yes, decent skills for a healer and martial artist. Zhu approached Kai, smiled and said that now he was 1 level higher. Maybe now he can also fight on equal terms with free riders? Kai said that, in fact, he also raised a level. He was already at the 4th level. Zhu grabbed his head and shouted that when did he manage to reach the 4th level? There was just a second one. Su looked in surprise and said that there were also 96 attribute points. Such indicators are equivalent to the 8th level. Kai replied that when he killed 2 stowaways, he was given the 3rd level, and when he returned here and killed 5 more, he was able to reach the 4th level. Zhu was angry and shouted with tears in his eyes that it was turning out that Kai was better than him again. How infuriating! Su asked what she would do next. He asked further in surprise. Then he raised his head up and answered what he had heard. Their captain said that they belonged to the 2nd group of stowaways, which means that there is also the 1st detachment whom they will kill. His team was very surprised by these words. Half a day later, somewhere in the forest of the newcomers' area, the 1st group of stowaways walked through the forest. laughing loudly and asking where such people came from. I wonder how weak the guys from the second team were that they were destroyed so quickly? It's high time to change them. This was the first detachment of stowaways, level 5. The commander-in-chief told them that it was enough to relax, but the authorities said that the matter was serious, so let them behave accordingly. One of the team members said that in any case, newcomers are limited to level 5, so it won't be too difficult for them to deal with them. The commander-in-chief answered correctly too. Zhu asked Kai if he was confident that he could fight 9 level 5 stowaways. He replied not to worry, even if he couldn't kill them, he would definitely be able to protect Su and Zhu. Besides, if they didn't try to kill them, they would destroy the other newcomers, so they needed to strike first. At that moment he ran away and began to attack the commander-in-chief, who shouted to his team to be careful. Someone's coming! The opponents laughed and said that this was just a 4th level beginner. Level 4? And he raised his level quite quickly. He must have been the one who defeated the second squad. The commander-in-chief smiled broadly and said that it's not bad, it's time to attack. He issued a decree for everyone to remain on alert. Let them not dare to lose to him. The professor shouted yes. Kai looked at his team and thought about how bad it was. It turns out that they also support the system? According to their original plan, he was supposed to lure the enemy, and then slowly get rid of them one by one. It was necessary to catch the stowaways one by one, but this detachment is too large, so it won't be easy. Now the main thing for them is to save themselves, and if possible, kill a few free riders. And the problem is not that they don't have countermeasures. If he wants to get rid of everyone at once, Kai began to draw out all his strength. Everything around began to sparkle with blue lightning. He will have to make a lot of effort. The rivals looked in surprise and asked in panic what he was doing. Kai ran past his opponent, who asked him where he was going. Are you really so scared that you can't decide which way to run? The opponent swung his sword, cut his shoulder, and shouted, "Get it!" Kai felt a little pain, but he only thought that no. Not close enough yet. The opponent at that moment looked after him in surprise and asked, "Is he still running away?" Kai continued that they were all not close enough. The stowaways were shouting that they would skin him. Kai ran straight at them. They all prepared their weapons, but Kai deftly dodged them, throwing them to the sides. The commander-in-chief looked from the side and asked what was the matter. Kai was visible in his pupils and he said that they have the 5th level, but he only has the 4th. How can he withstand their attacks? One of the stowaway team shouted that something was wrong. They had too little time to determine its characteristics. But once he analyzed it with a high-tech watch, he found that all of his attributes were beyond their ability to discern, but at least the agility was about 30 points. The commander-in-chief shouted, "What? 30 agility points?" The stowaway shouted that he must have made a mistake. At his 5th level, he has less than 20 points. How did Kai get so many? How can they even defeat him like that? The commander-in-chief stood, he began to shake, he looked at Kai and thought about what not. The clock couldn't have been wrong. If this guy really has such high agility, then who else is chasing who? The commander-in-chief scaredly screamed at the top of his lungs about how bad it was. They're under attack. They need to run. His team turned and asked in surprise, "What?" At that moment Kai grinned and said that they finally understood. Did they know that he had deceived them quite cleverly? But it was too late for them to run away. Shu began to fall on top of the stowaways with all his might and shouted for them to fall. Kai took out his spikes and, smiling, said that it was a good job, and now let them leave the rest to him. At that moment, a start was made and he defeated all the free riders, stopped, sighed heavily and said it was decided. Ju was sweating at that moment, his mouth was wide open and he shouted in surprise, he destroyed 9 representatives of the 5th level. What's wrong with Kai? The system reported that the traveler Jiang Kai, for killing level 5 stowaways, he receives 2,000 units of experience. The experience has reached the maximum, so he advances to the 5th level of beginners. Kai stood in front of the system and said that it was finally the 5th level. He thought that for every kill of a traveler above 1 level, the amount of experience gained doubles, so it turns out that he received 400 units from each holder of the 5th level. Su was delightedly surprised and shouted that he had reached the 5th level. She heard that this is the limit that can be reached in the beginner zone. Ju shouted, "Has he reached the limit?" Kai replied that it was nothing, they just lost a lot of experience, he still had survivors, so they needed to hurry. Su shouted, "Okay." Shu seriously asked what will happen next? He replied that before he needed to kill monsters to get experience points, now this need has disappeared, so he will simply help them. After they gain enough points, they will head to the finish line. Su happily shouted okay. Shu laughed, flexed his muscles and said that it was his turn to become strong. Kai, Su and Zhu walked through the forest. Kai told them to be careful. On the way to the finish they need to score as many points as possible. But the closer they move to the finish line, the stronger the monsters become. Even in the beginner zone there are bosses, you need be careful. Su agreed with his words. Suddenly they heard a growl, looked in fear. There were monsters lying on the ground that had already been killed. They looked questioningly and said that it was the corpse of a beast. There are a lot of bite marks on it. Did someone bite them to death? Kai began to take out the talent of focusing the ghost's eye. He looked and saw that he had just seen a golden light in the distance. Didn't they think that this golden creature could kill the monsters? Su asked the golden creature. Suddenly a bright light appeared behind them and flew towards them. At that moment Zhu was walking and asking what kind of creature this was. Could this attack them too? At this moment, the golden light attacked Su and Zhu, scratched them. They shouted that the golden light was a golden essence. This creature was chasing them. The golden light flew towards Kai, but it didn't scare him. He looked questioningly. Zhu shouted at him to dodge. This creature is very dangerous. Let him be on his guard. At that moment, everything around began to shine with a golden light. His team looked questioningly, and Kai grabbed the mouse in his hands and did not know what to say. The mouse was also very surprised. Zhu asked in surprise what? He caught it so quickly and is already holding it in his hands? Kai looked carefully at the hamster and asked, did they think this creature was fast? Isn't this a simple mouse? The mouse looked in surprise at that moment, and then began to get angry. In his language this meant that Kai was a villain. Who is he? He will regret it. Kai looked at how angry the mouse was and said that it looked like the little mouse was too impudent, then he would let him go. The hamster began to fall down, not understanding what was happening. He became suddenly angry. The golden light appeared again. He tried to attack Kai. Zhu at that moment got scared and shouted about why Kai let him go. He could even kill monsters. Kai grabbed the hamster again, then abruptly let go and said that everything was fine. It was too slow for him. This was repeated many times. He let go of the hamster and caught it again. This is all thanks to the focusing of the ghost's eye, plus the attribute of dexterity. All this is equal to the fact that he grabbed the mouse 10 times in a second. Zhu stood in surprise and asked about Kai being so fast. Su, covering her mouth in surprise, screamed about how cool it was. A few minutes later, the mouse was lying in the palm of his hand. Holding a white flag in his hand, the mouse lost. Kai held a tired hamster in his hand and said that it seemed like the mouse had nowhere to run. At this moment, Zhu was surprised and asked Kai irritably what kind of speed he has. Everyone turned to look at the monsters and Kai said that he did not know whether the mouse would be useful during battles, but a free assistant would not be superfluous. Kai put the mouse on his shoulder and told Su that she had almost reached the 4th level. Let her quickly find the corpses, and then take the remaining experience from them in order to reach level 5 at the end of the test. Su said okay and said that the mouse is very small. At this moment, Zhu was depressed and said that he felt like he was some kind of trash and not a martial arts master. At this moment, Huang Wei was walking through the forest, laughing loudly and saying that he had arrived. Finally! After so many days, he finally managed to reach the rookie zone. He came to the city of Xinyao, began to climb the stairs, and Xiao Tiao came out to the main gate, who said that he congratulated him on passing the newcomer test. Now he can officially become a Devil Star Traveler. Xiao Tiao was the newcomer's escort. He approached Wei, put his hand on her shoulder and said that unfortunately he was not the first, but the rating is not so important. The passage itself is what is important. Wei removed Tiao's hand and said that yes, he was not the first, but what made him think that Wei wanted to come running? He showed his collected killed monsters. Xiao asked in surprise what? The rating is calculated by points. He has a lot of killed monsters, but can he exchange them for points? How could a rookie kill so many monsters? Wei started taking off his hood, laughing loudly and talking nonsense. He is the second master of the Huang family. Future guild leader. He had special training before he came here. Xiao shouted what? The Huang family of the Xuanwu Guild. Xuanwu Guild is ranked among the top 10 in Xinyao City. Well, I'm not surprised he's so capable. Xiao smiled and said that Wei was congratulated, despite the fact that in terms of points he is not the very first. In terms of power he will definitely be among the top 10 in the city of Xinyao. Wei began to laugh loudly and talk about how he would definitely become great. Winning first place is just the first step. He said ominously if they give him a little more time, the entire Devil Star will fall at his feet. At this time, somewhere in the depths of the newcomer's zone, Kai, Su and Zhu were walking in the depths of the forest, and Kai was saying that it was strange. Half a day had already passed, but they had not met a single monster. What was the matter? He asked, smiling. It's not the mouse that scares them away, right? Su was touched by how he slept and said that yes, how is this possible? Because he's so cute. Suddenly, a loud growl was heard behind them. Everyone turned and saw the wolves. Kai was horrified and even lost the power of speech, stuttering. Did he say these were twilight wolves? A huge crowd of wolves began to surround them. They began to advance. Among them was the boss of the city's rookie zone, the king of the twilight rolls. Kai was terribly scared and shouted that this was the boss of the rookie zone. King of the twilight wolves. They've entered boss territory. The wolves surrounded them. Zhu shouted about what he heard. The king of the twilight wolves is the most powerful creature in the beginner zone, which no one has ever managed to kill. What will they do? At that moment Kai was holding a weapon in his hand, squeezing it tightly and thinking about what to do. There are too many wolves, he himself can run away, but in this case they will fight to the death. He called Su and Zhu, saying that they could not escape. All that remains is to break through. Kai shouted that they needed to kill the king quickly. They shouted okay. Zhu began to draw out his strength, touched the ground with his hand. Suddenly bright yellow lightning appeared. The yellow light began to repel the wolves and he shouted that this was a wonderful skill. Kai told Su to take advantage of his technique. Then Kai shouted that it was his turn. He started using Ghost Eye Focus. The card is in the ghost's hand. Kai began to attack the boss. It was as if he had been struck by lightning. Everyone around was terribly surprised. Kai shouted what? Failed to break through the defense? The boss of the wolves at that moment became terribly angry, began to growl loudly and all the wolves began to attack him. Su screamed in panic that things were bad. The Wolf King ordered his comrades to attack them. Zhu at that moment was holding the mouth of the wolf, who was attacking him and shouting that they would not be able to attack the king of wolves. We need to come up with something else. Kai at that moment was ready to fight and thought that the king's defense was too strong. They surrounded him. At this moment, the mouse was still sleeping and had a dream. Then he woke up, saw a bunch of wolves, did not understand what was happening, turned his head and realized that the wolf was a criminal. Kai at this moment was still trying to fight off the wolves, and the mouse began to get angry and use his strength to the maximum. Suddenly everything around was plunged into a yellow light. The mouse attacked the wolves, defeating one after him. Kai looked in surprise, thinking that the mouse could bite through the king of the wolves. He used the ghost eye focusing and saw that the mouse was able to injure the wolf. This is amazing. Thanks to him, his defense is broken. All that remains is to apply a little pressure on the wound and then the wolf king will lose. Kai used his power and directed it at the boss, hitting him. The wolf's boss began to growl loudly. The mouse jumped joyfully. Kai at that moment thought that almost, if they use focus to strike, perhaps at that moment Kai threw spikes into the wolf's wound and used a 200 discharge. The wolf screamed in pain. Su at that moment looked in surprise, covered her face with her hand from the bright light and asked what? Strike Kai. Zhu was surprised at that moment and shouted, did he kill the king of the twilight wolves? At that moment Kai himself did not expect such a turn of events. He was a little scared. The system reported that it congratulated the traveler on his victory over the boss of the newcomers, the king of the twilight wolves. Kai stood there, thinking about what is this? And he thought their battle would last a very long time, so it turns out that they managed to defeat him with a 200,000th crystal blow. This was also the first time he had been able to use a critical strike of such power. Su and Zhu were surrounded by wolves, and then they said that it looked like the wolves were leaving. Kai turned to him and asked if they could still fight. They shouted what they could. Kai answered great. Since the king is no more, there are only wolves left, just pathetic insects. Su and Zhu were scared and tired. They said that they barely survived. Kai shouted at them not to let them go alive. The team began to use their abilities. Each attacked as best they could, according to their capabilities. Su, at the moment when Zhu attacked the wolves, she saved him with her healing magic. Kai was very serious at that moment. After a while everyone was defeated. The guys laughed and talked about how they had finished. Zhu said that he did not expect that they would be able to defeat the boss of the rookie zone. Su added that they are all very cool. Kai turned to them and told them to get ready to earn points. The guys were delighted, and then asked what next? Kai raised his head up and said that now they have a lot of points in reserve, so they will go to the finish line. A few hours later, Zhu stood in the city territory and laughed, saying that it turns out that this city territory is on the Devil's Star? Kai smiled and said that of course, the city is the largest recreation center in all of the Devil's Land. Sue added that it was very lively. Then she saw that the mouse was running away. She told Kai about it. Kai reacted calmly, smiled and said that everything was fine. The mouse was absolutely free. If fate brought them together again, he wouldn't mind. At this moment, in the reception hall after the test in the beginner area, many people were standing in front of the screens. Xiao met Kai, Sue and Zhu and said congratulations on passing the test. His name is Xiao Tiao. He is a guide for all beginners. Kai walked behind him and asked if he could see the rating. They told him of course. At that moment Wei met them, Kai met them, laughed and said what a coincidence. Who would have thought that his employee would also take part in the test? Let him show him the rating. He was angry, looked at him seriously and thought that he did not expect to see Huang Wei. Wei showed his system and shouted that he was the first. But they also took first place. The truth from the end. The rest of the participants smiled maliciously and said that they should just look at this rabble. How soon did you have enough conscience? Everyone laughed loudly and shouted that it was complete garbage. Kai remembered that his sister Z, in order to save up for his trip to the Devil Star, worked in the Wei house. This terrible man often pestered her. In addition, he often beat Kai. Wei attacked him with a bat and shouted that he was trash. Zhu at that moment became terribly angry and shouted to Wei that he would wash his mouth with soap. Kai began to calm Zhu down and say that everything was fine. Kai put his hands in his pocket, smiled and asked, "Do they think this is it?" He was also talking about free riders, took out his hands and poured the watch onto the floor, and asked if it was possible to convert everything into points. Xiao asked in surprise, "Is this the watch of the stowaways of Country Ale?" Wei shouted, "What? Free riders?" Then he laughed out loud and said that, yes, they are lying. How can newbies kill stowaways? Liars! Where did the free riders even come from for the competition? Folks, did any of them see this? The rest of the participants shouted no. He didn't see anyone. Wei pointed and shouted for Xiao to look. Everyone said they didn't see any stowaways. They are lying. They advise you to cancel their points and check them to the fullest. Xiao was confused, tried to say something, but they interrupted him and shouted at him to figure it out. Took it more seriously. Let him punish them. Xiao began to calm people down and said that free riders had indeed appeared, but there was simply no time to report it. Wei was surprised at that moment. Lu walked behind him and said that he was also surprised when he heard about them. So he proposes to reward Jiang Kai and his comrades for their dedication. Lu Jun is the deputy commander-in-chief of the city military region. Wei at that moment began to worry terribly and asked what? This is Lu, the deputy commander-in-chief. It turns out that they actually killed the stowaways, is that true? Lu approached Kai and said that in order to somehow reward him, it was decided to increase his reward in the form of equipment. Wei was angry when he heard these words. Lu continued to say that the original reward for second and third place was increased from B to A. As for the first place, the reward was increased to S. Kai at that moment was terribly surprised and did not understand what was happening, but said thank you. Su looked at him enthusiastically and shouted cool. Zhu was also happy and asked really? At this moment, the rest of the participants were shocked. They began to panic and asked what? The reward has been increased. Is there such equipment at all? Kai received the Devil Star class. Kai began to explain that currently, Devil Star equipment is divided into categories from F to S, where F is the lowest amount of equipment, and S is accordingly the best. As a rule, B and C equipment are considered to be quite good, A and S grade equipment are considered rarer. These are exactly what every traveler dreams of. Wei got angry, clenched his fist and thought that Kai had not only removed him from his position as leader, but also received S-rank equipment. Wei shouted angrily about how unfair it was. Something is definitely wrong here. The Kai family is the lowest class, how can he compete with him? Kai began to get angry and asked whether this was important in this situation. He warns not to dare insult his family. Wei took out his weapon, began to attack and asked what he wants to say. He was mistaken. They are beggars, aren't they? His brother is sick and his sister is a cleaner. He was crawling at his feet. But today you decided to change everything? Kai lowered his head down and was simply silent. Wei at that moment ran up and shouted that he himself knew that his sister was still working in his house. Therefore, let him not dare to anger him. Or one day he will get to her. Kai at that moment was faster. He wounded Wei in the chest, and Wei did not expect this. The participants were shocked and asked what? His comrades were terribly surprised. Kai didn't listen to anyone, he was angry, and Lu asked him if Huang Wei had defeated him. The participants shouted that Wei came from the Huang family, and she was among the top 200 best guilds in the country. Kai, how did he even have the courage to do this? Wei sat on the floor and bled, shouting at Kai about how dare he harm him. Does he know what will happen to him now? Kai grinned and confidently said that he was the first to insult his family. He thinks he doesn't understand who he is. Wei got scared at that moment. Kai turned around, shouted that family is the most important thing in his life. At that moment everyone watched silently. Kai ran up, bent over Wei and said that it doesn't matter who insulted his family, in any case. At that moment, Wei tried to stop him. Kai did not listen to him, and shouted that he would kill everyone. Suddenly, he sharply pierced Wei's body and killed him. The system reported that Kai killed a first-level traveler, thereby earning 6 experience points. Does he want to take them? Kai got angry, sighed and asked, is it only 6 experience points? Is his family really that poor? The rest of the participants shouted how dare he kill the heir of the Huang family? Even though he is still alive in reality, the Huang family's anger will not go away. It was very brave. Lu stood behind Kai and thought that yes, this guy does not lose his cool, he is an amazing person. Then he cleared his throat and shouted that Kai killed Wei in self-defense, so he proposes to close this issue. Lu turned to Kai and said that the 3 of them should follow him and take him to the rewards. Kai was delighted and shouted okay, thank you very much. Shu was surprised at that moment, and told Kai that he was very cool. Su shouted what was amazing. On the territory of the city, Kai, Su and Zhu stood on the white veranda. Lu said that now they can look at their equipment, let them open it faster. Su was happy and shouted thank you. She went to her case, opened it, and a bright golden light appeared from there. A stone flew up and she shouted that it was the Jade Stone of Life. The equipment that every healer dreams of when starting out. Lu smiled and said yes, Life Jade adds 15 points to physique and spirit. This has a very positive effect on the healing process. Zhu also opened his case, and there was a combat suit in it. He shouted for everyone to look. He has armor. And very cute. Lu began clapping his hands and said that black rhinoceros skin armor increases defense by 16 points, and reduces damage received by 16%. The equipment is perfect for both attack and defense. Zhu was happy, kissed his hand, laughed, and talked about what was just right for him. Su at that moment was talking about Kai looking at what he had. Kai reached for the case and began to open it. His eyes were terribly surprised. The system reported that this was unidentified equipment and needed to be checked. There were knives in his case. Lu thought for a moment, and then said that this equipment probably requires a special ID? Zhu asked in surprise, even like that? Apparently he is very cool. Lu extended his hand to Kai with a blue card and said that yes, very good equipment usually requires an ID. He has one, so he can help. Lu swiped the card over the case. The system reported that these were 9 pursuit blades. But Lu asked in surprise, is he responsible for critical damage? The attack power of a simple beginner is usually small, so the critical damage of this rank seems to be not as good as A rank equipment. Zhu shouted in disappointment that apparently Kai was unlucky. Su asked if Kai could change equipment. Lu sighed heavily and replied that it was very troublesome, but he could try to do something. At that moment Kai shouted no. No need to change anything. Suits him. At that moment, everyone looked at him in surprise. Kai picked up the weapon and thought that good equipment, you couldn't imagine anything better. Now his damage will be not 2, but 200 times more powerful, 2,000 times the crystal damage. After such a critical hit, even the king of the Twilight Rolls will die in one hit. It's a pity that his normal critical strike is not particularly high, so it won't be easy, but each use of the 9 pursuit blades will increase the speed by at least 10%, but after several hits, the speed and power of the critical strike will be increased by 90%, an ideal item for gambler. Lu was surprised. He smiled and said that okay, fine, if you like, now they can return to Earth. But Lu walked up to Kai, put his hand on his shoulder and said that he just wants to warn, someone might be looking for him, he better be careful, so he walks him home. At this moment the guys did not understand what was happening. At this time, on Earth, in the kingdom of the gods in a poor area of the city, Kai was riding a bicycle and thinking that he did not expect that the test would go so smoothly. I wonder what my brother and the others will say. Suddenly I saw something and thought about where these expensive cars come from. Is someone planning to develop the area? Kai held the phone in his hand and thought that, oh well. Kai happily started running home and shouted to his brother and sister Z that he was back. Let them guess who passed the newbie test. But suddenly he stopped abruptly and was terribly surprised. In front of him was Chief Wan, surrounded by his guards. They asked, and who is it back? They say he passed the rookie test? Kai was surprised and asked, is he Wei's brother? What do they want? Suddenly they grabbed him by the arms and began to twist him behind his back, shouting for him to kneel down. They held the bat, smiled and talked about how he knew that his brother had to undergo treatment from a psychiatrist after he killed him in the Devil's Star. No one has ever dared to do this to the Huang family. Kai looked up, got angry, and shouted that he had disgraced Wei and he would do the same to him. Began to swing his bat. Kai was a little confused, but suddenly the door opened sharply. The villains flew back and asked who? Lan Lan and Ing appeared, turned to Kai and said that he had been warned to be more careful when returning home. Why did he let the warning pass by? Ing was looking at us seriously at this moment, holding his hands in his pocket. Lan Lan stood on the threshold of the house. Her face was serious, her eyebrows knitted together. Her hair was blowing in the wind, her hand was extended forward, she was showing paper sheets. Lan Lan shouted for none of them to move. The military is already here. The guys got scared. One of the men started to get nervous and leaned back, shouting, "What?" "Yes, this is the commander-in-chief of the city military region, Wei Ying." De looked ahead seriously, his eyes hidden by dark glasses, but the panic on his face could not be hidden. He shouted, "Why is he here?" Their mouths were wide open, they looked forward. Ying lit a cigarette, a stream of smoke flew to the side. His eyes shone yellow, his forehead was tense, and many wrinkles appeared there. He inhaled cigarette smoke, and said that they had come for Kai. They shouldn't have touched him. Do was nervous, a lot of beads of sweat ran down his face. He knitted his eyebrows together and said angrily, "Has the commander-in-chief arrived for Kai's sake?" "How so? Who is he?" Kai began to lean against the wall, and slowly began to stand on his knee. His gait was uncertain, his eyes flashed green, he looked forward with his lips tightly pursed. He thought that such a powerful person had come for him. De looked down, his hands were tied by the police. Two men with scowling expressions stood behind him and held him up to the police car, telling him to keep his head down. Behind them was a 3-story building on which Kai, the commander-in-chief, and Lan Lan stood. Kai took hold of the railing. It was illuminated by the setting sun. Kai said that he was very grateful for Ying's help. "But why are they?" Ying continued to smoke a cigarette and looked ahead angrily. Smoke enveloped them, and with knitted eyebrows he said not to be nervous, they came for a reason. In the beginner's test, he, Zhu and Su showed good results. Lan Lan stood nearby, she crossed her arms under her chest. Her eyes were closed, and she did not say anything. At the same time, Ying continued, did he know that after he left, they were invited to military service? They came to invite him too. Ying thought about the smiling and rather serious Zhu and Su, who was shocked, blushed a little and turned back. Ying exhaled cigarette smoke, put the cigarette away from his mouth, and said that he had been invited to represent a new profession. Kai's eyes narrowed, shock was reflected on his face, he did not understand what was happening and wondered. Lan Lan turned her head sharply, her eyes looked at him seriously and she asked, does he know what the emergence of new professions means? Lan Lan's hair fluttered in the wind and she continued that there are currently many professions for travelers, but they can be changed once a person reaches the 20th level. She presented a diagram where the strength is shown by an upward arrow and the level is shown by an arrow to the side. Professions could be changed. If everyone started at approximately the same level, then a person could fall down at level 100 and his strength decreased. But a person with lower strength at the beginning could rise up and his level increased. He could be congratulated on his change of profession. Lan Lan continued that whenever a profession changes, the attributes and skills also change. Some travelers become stronger, while others become weaker. The current professions are not that necessary, so the military prefer to exchange them for new ones. His profession is considered new. Lan Lan imagined a man with glowing eyes holding a chess set in his hands. They denoted people and there were professions, warrior, healer, executioner, beggar, and many others. The pieces fell onto the chessboard. Lan Lan turned to look at him, her heels clicking on the floor, while Kai calmly looked at her with a wary gaze and pursed lips. His hair was disheveled, and Lan Lan asked if he wanted to join them. He shouldn't worry and they won't rush him. Lan Lan looked at him, while Ying continued to stand nearby. The shadows of the building fell on them. Kai looked down, holding the handrail with his hands. Lan Lan said that she was sorry for this, but they had researched information about him and his family before coming here. According to them, his brother is seriously ill. Her face became more gloomy and angry. Her eyebrows fell into her eyes. She spread her arms to the sides and said that if he agreed to join them, they would definitely protect his family and cover all his brother's medical expenses. Kai pursed his lips tightly. His eyes were hidden and he continued to look forward. He didn't answer. Ing went first, put his hands in his pockets, lowered his head and said with closed eyes, "What? After all, he will go to the Devil's Star in order to cover the costs of treatment, right? If he agrees, then let him come to them tomorrow or the day after tomorrow." Ing held the cigarette in his teeth and walked further. Lan Lan half turned to Kai and said that he could find her. Kai turned around, looked at the retreating backs of the people and his gaze was serious, and he said that he was asking for forgiveness, but he refused. Ing and Lan Lan turned around sharply. Lan Lan's eyes reflected bewilderment and misunderstanding. She screamed in shock, "Why?" They both froze on the stairs while Kai calmly said that he knew everyone wanted to join them, especially those with the warrior profession and healers who can help them. Kai's face became serious and a little angry. He put his hand to his chest, his hair fluttered in the wind and he continued, "But he is different. And his profession is also different. Do they remember when the profession of drunkard appeared? All the military were passionate about this, trying to attract others like them, right? The military helped drunkards in everything, and because of this, alcohol began to be freely sold and distributed." Kai imagined a picture where a man stood on a huge square or stage with a huge barrel of alcohol, handing out drinks to everyone. The people around him roared, many women and men surrounding him as the alcohol continued to flow down their glasses. They were all smiling and drunk. The military watched this. They were angry. Kai continued, "When the military discovered that drinking did not bring the expected effect, the drunkards were simply abandoned. Who would use a change of profession to become a drunkard? Yes, this is much worse than a beggar. Many people became poor. They sat on the floor, begging for at least a couple of coins from someone, living in a huge trash can." Kai said as for him, this time it took him by surprise. He didn't think they would strike soon. He will leave the lands as soon as possible, and he is grateful for their help. Besides, the three of them have lived together for more than 10 years. He remembered his sister, whom he rolled in his arms. She was cheerful on him, laughing, hugging him by the shoulders, while his brother calmly and at the same time looked at them with a smile. Kai smiled. A sparkle appeared in his eyes, saying that he had also long been accustomed to taking fate into his own hands, and not shifting responsibility to others. Lan Lan's face became gloomy, and she shouted that humanity was now experiencing the end of the world. His profession can greatly help the world. Humanity needs it more than ever. Why does he even have such bad thoughts about them? Kai said that he apologizes to them, but he only wants to protect his family, and that's all. Ing walked up to Lan Lan and took her by the shoulder. His mouth bared, the smoke from the cigarette continued to waft into the air. Lan Lan was shocked. She screamed, "He?" Ing shook his head and told her not to interfere. He understood what he wanted to say. Kai stood taller than them, looking forward seriously. Ing put down his cigarette and said that habits developed over 10 years are hard to change in a couple of days. The setting sun illuminated everything behind them. Ing continued that he himself understands that his brother does not have much time. He lowered his hand, shook the ashes down. His hand was relaxed, and he said that in the future he would not be able to fight alone. So why don't they make a bet? Ing smiled. His teeth took on a bestial grin, and he said that over the next month the military will continue to protect his relatives from the attacks of the Huang family. If he can save up for his brother's operation in this month, then let them consider that they accept his independence. They won't interfere anymore. Kai's gaze became gloomy and serious. He looked forward angrily, pursing his lips. Ing lowered his head a little. His eyes flashed dangerously and he continued, "If he doesn't have time to save up, the military will cover all medical expenses, but he will have to join them. Does he agree to this?" Lan Lan behind him wanted to argue something. Her face fell and her mouth opened. Kai stood calmly, did not say anything. His hands were clenched into fists. Ing and Lan Lan climbed the steps. Ing put his hands in his pockets, looking ahead. Kai smiled a little, then laughed, closing his eyes and said, "Okay, he agrees." A bright light poured onto his face. A little while later, the full moon illuminated a huge building with many pipes and garbage below. Kai thought that he needed to quickly return to the Devil's Star in order to save up for treatment. He began to close the door to the dark room. On the table there was a paper with the inscription, "Brother, is Z still working?" He passed the test, but he is forced to return to the Devil's Star again. The paper was secured with a large glass. Kai walked past garbage and many poor people who were drinking. He had a hood on, his hands in his pockets, and he thought that while his family was in danger from the Huang family, he could not leave them in such a place. He needed to move to a more prosperous area. Kai's gaze became gloomy and serious. His eyebrows fell over his eyes, and the corners of his lips went down, and he continued to think that he would have to try very hard so that he could earn all the necessary amount. Devil's Star, City of the Gods. The huge tall buildings were illuminated by the clear sky and sun. Many people were walking down the street, some were laughing. The young guy hid his hands in his pockets, the guy next to him was looking at something. Kai changed into new equipment, looked around himself and thought with a smile that he could now officially begin his journey. Since he's already changed, he can go to work. But first he needs to join the guild. He stood on the stone path, looked around from the side, and suddenly saw a wooden sign with an inscription on the wall. He thought that since the monsters on the Devil's Star are very strong, it would not make sense for him to fight alone, so all newcomers should join the guild. He imagined a huge purple monster defeating one guy, and then a picture of a group of several people defeating the same monster. His feet made quiet footsteps. He opened the door of the guild and thought, for people, this is a large organization of travelers. This is where you can create a team to fight monsters side by side and raise your level. He can see where he can join. He pulled the door to the side, a smile painted his face, and he walked forward with a firm gait, saying that he wanted to join the guild. The administrator smiled sweetly and suddenly became nervous. Her eyes opened wide and she asked, "But is he Kai?" "He is currently prohibited from joining the guild." Kai didn't understand, got nervous and asked why all of a sudden. The administrator pointed to the poster at the back. His photograph was crossed out with a black cross. She got nervous and said that Juan had blacklisted him. Kai became nervous. These words struck him in the heart, and the administrator added that this is why he can only fight alone. Kai stopped and seemed to turn into stone. On the outskirts, safe zone, selection. Many people in different clothes stood near the entrance to the cave. Several flying blue crystals illuminated the ground. There were both ordinary people and magicians, warriors and other representatives of various professions with animal and magical ears or tails. Kai thought, does it mean that now no guild will accept him? He scratched the back of his head and walked past the blue crystal to the large steps leading up. He continues to think, will his adventure really end before it even begins? Suddenly someone called him and asked if he had already decided where to go. Kai began to turn around and saw a girl. She smiled sweetly, pointed her finger, jumped forward, covered one eye and said that she was Yen. She can help him decide on the zone. The cost of one fortune telling is 100 coins. Profession Yen, level 29. Kai stopped, turned around and looked at her with skepticism. He looked at her point blank. The girl's eyes shone brightly. She was sweet and friendly. Suddenly Kai turned around sharply, shook his head, waved his hand at her, and said that he was asking for forgiveness, but he didn't believe it at all. The girl panicked, shook her hands and told him to wait. She got nervous, ran after him, opened her eyes, her face turned red. She showed the numbers with her hands and told him not to leave. For him the fortune-telling would cost 80 coins. Then she said that it was only 30 coins. She started to get even more nervous, shook and continued, or it would be free. This will be a reward for him. Suddenly Kai began to smile. His hair quickly flew up, he closed his eyes and embarrassment covered his face. He quickly walked up to her and shouted that he was suitable for free. Now he's not so inflexible. The girl was shocked, put her hands forward. Her eyes opened and she thought, did he take the bait? What a parasite! She grimaced, closed her eyes and began to take a card out of her pocket. A blue punishment glowed in her hands. And she thought, okay, she'll try it. The magical complex glowed yellow. The arrow began to move and explore a lot of yellow energy in the form of lightning. The girl remained serious. Her face darkened in her hands. She was holding a circle. There were yellow magic symbols. Nearby the wind blew her clothes and hair. She said he was now in crisis. She invites him to go to the ruler's valley. Not far from them there was a blue crystal. There was a lot of greenery around. The compass was pointing forward. Kai thought for a moment, looked away and presented a finger to his chin. He shook his head a little and thought, this is dangerous. But in the safe zone no one can harm his physical body, so in that he is safe. Plain of ashes. The huge lava area was littered with strange slime with eyes and red goblins with weapons. Craters exploded here and there and flames enveloped it. Currently, newcomers usually earn experience in the ash plain, where players from level 1 to 10 gather, but there is a small chance that the Huang family will send someone there to kill him. Mountain Pass. The sun shone brightly on the beautiful mountains with lots of greenery. And below, huge waves of water splashed, covering the mountains. The pass is usually occupied by travelers from level 15. If he goes there now, he will die. As for the Ruler's Valley, it is created for travelers from the 10th level. With his current strength, it is unlikely that he will be able to withstand the monsters living in those places. Kai clenched his fist and looked at the crystal with the Ruler's Valley. He was serious, put one hand on his belt and thought that now, the Huang family would not even think about him going there. He grinned, his eyes sparkling dangerously as he tilted his head and slammed his fist against his fist. He thought, okay, if he is not allowed to join guilds, then he will work on his own. The Ruler's Valley will be his starting point. The girl stood near the crystal. She panicked and was nervous. She grimaced a little. Kai ran forward, turned around, waved and thanked her. The girl was in shock and horror. Her eyes widened and her pupils constricted. Sweat was dripping from her face from nerves. She spread her arms to the sides and thought, let him wait. Will he go there alone? She was talking about the team. Does he even know what this place is? This will ruin him. The girl sat down and started rummaging through her bag. She panicked and thought, she doesn't care. It's none of her business. She needs to run away faster before she receives negative feedback from him. Valley of the Ruler. Huge beautiful green mountains were illuminated by the sun. From one of the mountains there was a large waterfall descending into a cloud of steam. Green trees decorated it. Kai walked forward along the earthen path with a serious face. He waved his arms, which contained red blades. His gait was confident, and he thought, is this the Ruler's Valley? He wonders how strong the monsters here are. Suddenly he heard a menacing and terrifying scream. Kai was scared at first. He turned around and clenched his teeth. His eyes were alarmed. He raised his hand with blades to his body and thought that something was wrong here. A huge toothy mouth with many fangs and a long tongue roared. The monkey-like creature swung its paws, huge tusks protruded from its mouth and glowing red eyes. Several people were thrown to the side. One of the guys tried to cover himself with a sword and deflect the blow. The guy shouted at them to hold on. The archer and the magician and the warrior flew back. The swordsman stood in front trying to take a fighting position. Monster, giant monkey, level 11, strength 172, constitution 68, agility 142, spirit 13, defense 3. Around the monkey there were many red signs foreshadowing danger. The monkey flew towards them. It opened its mouth wide and leaned on its front paws for better walking. One of the guys shouted, "This is a level 11 monkey. If they try, they can overcome this. They all need to try harder." The archer stood up and began to draw the bowstring. His arrow glowed blue and explored a lot of energy. The magician raised his staff upward. A green sphere appeared around the end of the staff, while a warrior with a yellow barrier rushed towards the monkey. The swordsman grabbed his sword better and shouted that he understood. The monkey raised his hand back, creating a black aura around his paw, and began to strike forward. There was a roar. Kai hid behind a rock. He looked down and asked, "Is this a travel team battle? It's quite busy. And the monsters in the valley look strong. He doesn't know if he can handle them himself." He calmly stood behind the stone and watched this. Suddenly his eyes widened. Echoes of someone's energy reached him. He got scared and turned around, seeing 3 huge giant monkeys with glowing red eyes. Kai jumped back in fear. He leaned his knee on the ground and shouted that they had arrived. He raised one hand to his chest, his hair disheveled, his mouth wide open. Kai thought, he just thought, there are no such coincidences. He looked at the information clock. The monkeys roared. The signs appeared. Giant monkey, level 12, dangerous shades. Giant monkey, level 13, dangerous score. Giant monkey, level 14, dangerous score. Monkeys with a dark aura rushed at him. They swung, opening their mouths with teeth. A team of celestial swordsmen kills a level 11 giant monkey. And the whole team rejoiced at the victory. They laughed and raised their weapons up. The giant monkey was defeated and lay on his back. Steam was coming from her stomach and her mouth was open. The warrior shouted, "This is victory." The magician said they were very cool. The warrior looked at the swordsman, raised his finger up and shouted that they were at the 10th level, and they were already able to defeat the monkey giant of the 11th level without losses. They can even break the record. The swordsman grinned and looked at his comrade. He lowered his head, closed his eyes and bared his teeth, saying, "Of course, because they have a very cool captain." He smiled. Suddenly they heard a noise. A huge streak of dust and lightning flashed behind the captain. The entire team turned around in alarm as their eyes widened and mouths dropped open. They saw 3 huge giant monkeys chasing Kai. He jumped from the ground. The monkeys tried to grab him with their claws and constantly pursued him. Kai gritted his teeth, his eyes turning dangerous. He wondered if he had wandered into their territory by mistake. Suddenly the warrior became nervous and shouted in fear, turning to the captain, "Is he fighting alone against 3? The swordsman frowned, clenched his teeth, and said that each of them was above the level of the one they were fighting with. The magician cautiously shouted that they should help him. The swordsman was scared himself. He did not take his eyes off the monkeys and said that he must have attracted them himself. They can help him. Otherwise, they themselves risk dying. He turned to his teammates and said seriously that they needed to run. A huge explosion came from behind him. The captain's face was terrified, his eyes wide open and his eyebrows drawn together. The information science said that the level 12 giant monkey was killed. The monkey flew over the trees with a roar and roar. Kai's blades began to glow red as he tightened his grip on it. Kai rested his knee and hand on the ground, a bright snow-white smile shining on his face. He clenched his fist with blades, red steam came out of it, and his hair fluttered in the wind. He thought, great. The critical strike speed has been increased, and the possibility of supercrit has also appeared. The swordsman was shocked, his face was distorted, sweat flowed down his face, and he said that they all fought together to kill the 11th level monkey. Behind him, the archer shouted in shock, and he was alone. Horror appeared on his face. The swordsman asked, did he kill a level 12th monkey in a matter of seconds? The whole team was shocked and stared at Kai. 2 more huge giant monkeys with stern and red eyes rushed towards him through the forest, trying to grab him with their claws. Kai ran away from them. He did not turn around and ran forward faster and faster. Suddenly he turned his head, smiled widely and thought with excitement, he's moving on. He grabbed the blades harder and pointed them straight at the monkey. The blade flew with a red column of energy, and lightning bolts straight forward into the monkey's heart. One of the monkeys flew back, and its relative turned around. Giant monkey level 13 killed. Kai smiled widely, and his eyes began to sparkle with joy, and he thought, great. This time, critical strike speed has been increased by another 10%. It couldn't be better. The whole team was in shock. They widened their eyes and watched in horror what was happening. They did not understand what was happening, and the swordsman nervously asked, what? Did he kill another one? The strongest giant monkey continued to rush after Kai. All his paws left the ground and he did not close his mouth trying to eat him. Kai was jumping from below and thought, great. Now he will take out another one. The swordsman came to his senses and shouted that this monkey of the 14th level is the strongest here. He doesn't believe that he can kill this too. The swordsman opened his mouth wide and watched what was happening tirelessly. Kai began to turn around and looked at the monkey with a serious look, thinking that his physical strength was almost running out. Soon he would not be able to escape. His jacket fluttered in the wind. He tightened his grip on the blade, red aura engulfing his hand. He raised his hand palm up and the blades became like spikes. He thought that he would have to speed up and deal with this before he was caught. He would kill it first. Suddenly, he was completely covered in a red aura, red light rushing around him. He spread his arms to the sides and many red blades with lightning bolts flew forward. Dozens of blades aimed at the giant monkey, who roared. Lightning illuminated everything around. The monkey was struck by lightning and shock. It roared in pain, creating a sound wave. Kai stopped on the ground, got into a fighting position and, with his eyes wide open, shouted, great. The critical hit was just in time. Giant monkey level 14 killed. The monkey's corpse was lying on the ground, its mouth was open, and a blade with a dark aura was sticking out of its forehead. The team of heroes was in shock, their faces painted with horror. Suddenly they looked forward in disbelief and shock. The swordsman said, but he killed all 3. Even their team of 12 people couldn't cope, and he alone took them all out? So who is he? They were all nervous, the monkey's eyes were wide open. Kai took his blade out of his forehead. He peered into the monkey's face and left his body. He did not think that he would have to sweat so much. He looked at the blue information boards where all 3 giant monkeys were displayed. He put his hands on his hips and thought, but now that he's got 3 monster cards, it doesn't seem so difficult. Suddenly he jumped, landed on a rock and ran on. The swordsman was shocked. He bent over and watched him. Suddenly his face distorted and he shouted that there was trouble. The great man is leaving. What should they do now? He put his hands in front of him. He was practically crying and upset, asking why no one detained him. What a pity! His teammates watched him and with strange expressions wondered what was wrong with their captain. Plain of ashes. The vast plains were covered with many burning particles. Several people split into groups. One of the men shouted, "Is his eyesight failing him? There are 3 warriors, 1 soldier and 1 healer?" Suddenly the warrior squeezed the girl's throat. She began to choke. One of the people shouted, "Is this the famous Falcon team from the Huang Guild? Why did they come to the newcomers' area? This is too simple a location for them." The level 20 healer said that they searched everything, but they never found Kai. Not far from her stood a level 20 warrior, another level 20 warrior, and a level 20 soldier. They all smiled, crossed their arms, and watched the crowd carefully. One of the 20th level warriors with a malicious smile continued to strangle the girl, saying that she saw Kai, and let her already tell where he went. Yen clenched her teeth, closed one eye, she was shaking and asked why he needed it. The healer bared her teeth. Her eyebrows drew down to her eyes. She looked forward angrily. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and asked if she didn't know him. The other guy smiled evilly and asked if she understood that Kai provoked the Huang family, so he should be punished. The fortune teller wheezed from lack of air. She wrapped her hands around the warrior's hand. Her eyes were closed and she asked heavily, "Is this true? Kai is in the ruler's valley. They can find him there." The warrior threw the fortune teller to the ground with all his strength, and the girl landed back painfully, and with a roar. The people around them were in shock. The war had already begun to turn around and move forward. He turned to her and said, "Okay. But if she lied to them, they will find her and kill her." Other people were scared. One of the people said nervously, "This is the strongest team of level 20 hunters. He thinks Kai won't be able to stand up to them." Next to the guy stood a cute girl with ears. All the people were shocked. Yen looked down and took the card in her hand. She leaned over and asked, "Are they strong?" Fortune tellers will never tell rude people the truth. Her face became angry. She looked ahead with a frown and quietly said that she had made a hexagram that showed that if they went to Kai, they would die. A skull appeared on the tile, emitting purple dark energy. Many flames spread out in all directions. A day later, the Valley of the Ruler. The green mountains were illuminated by the sun, and a huge forest grew near it. Kai smiled, but at the same time looked gloomily at the information sign. He said, "Great." He killed 16 giant monkeys and broke through to level 6. Traveler Kai. Profession Gambler, level 6. Stats: Strength 24, Constitution 208, Agility 42, Fortitude 42, Defense 0, Critical Chance 0.1%, Critical Strike 20,000%, Experience 85 out of 3,200. Kai stood on a huge monkey corpse. Steam was coming out of it. He clenched one hand into a fist and looked at the monkey card. He thought that some people were saying that the corpse of a giant ape could be sold for a very decent amount. He thought for a moment, then grinned and thought, if he can earn money, he will pay for all his brother's expenses. Suddenly he heard someone's voice asking if he wanted to join them. Kai began to turn around. His eyes expressed bewilderment. The wind blew and ruffled his hair. Behind him stood a crowd of people in white clothes. Kai looked at them directly. The leader said that they have 3 teams of people here who are hunting giant monkeys. Several people with different weapons were looking forward. One guy crossed his arms over his chest, another put his hand in his pockets. The other group consisted of 3 men with daggers who were already looking forward. Their cloak leader continued that if he joined them, he would gain access to the elite's treasure chests. He agrees? They were all smiling. Kai lowered his head a little and asked seriously, "Is this a team?" But he doesn't have his own team. Will he really be alone? Suddenly their leader bared his teeth, lowered his head, his eyebrows fell over his eyes and he said angrily, "Everything is fine, let him just help them." The bright sun continued to illuminate the forest below, trees towered over a huge cliff, and many people stood there. The leader asked, "Does he see this?" Near the rock lay 4 elite giant monkeys, level 15. All the information signs indicated this. The man continued, 4 elite giant monkeys live there, and a treasure chest is kept in a cave next to it. But these are 4, and the level is also high, so they definitely won't be able to cope without his help. Each team consisted of 3 people. They stood behind Kai, who was watching the monkeys from a cliff. The captain thought that Kai could attract their attention. Each group would break 1 giant for themselves. And the man continued that he just needed to take one of them away, and they would deal with the 3 themselves. For his help he would get access to the chest. Kai thought for a moment, looked down and imagined a treasure chest. He thought, an elite treasure chest? Some say that a luxury chest contains a lot of good things that can be sold for a decent amount. And he needs to get this. He continued to think, suddenly looked away. His gaze became cautious and he thought that they were not at all worried about his safety, since they asked him to speak alone. Most likely, they hope that he will not return alive. He looked at the people, they looked ahead angrily, their eyes glowed red, evil grins adorned their faces. Suddenly Kai smiled, shook his head and thought, well, it's time for him to show them true skill. He said he agreed. Suddenly the captain became inspired, pulled his sword forward and up, shouting, great, they must start acting. He sent the first team forward. A crowd of people ran forward with shouts and weapons, saying that they were following his orders. Many stones were flying along the mountain. They created a lot of noise as they fell down. Kai was the first to go, his eyes sparkling in the sun. All the elite giant monkeys woke up, they roared and looked forward. Their huge tusks almost reached their foreheads. The captain shouted angrily, what is he doing? He opened his mouth wide, his pupils constricted. Kai began to run forward. A huge wave of light remained in front of him. His eyes glowed blue and he shouted, now! Suddenly a powerful arrow of energy struck the giant monkey. He roared in pain, his eyes glowed and he ran after Kai. He destroyed the ground beneath him. Kai continued to run forward and turn around. The other giant monkeys focused on other people. The captain shouted joyfully, this is not bad. He's great. He watched closely, his cloak fluttering back. He shouted, very soon they will get the chest. It's time for them to get into the game. Many people ran forward towards the giant monkeys. They had a variety of weapons, explosions and flashes of flame swept across the clearing. 3 monkeys ran at them with their claws, their angry faces pointed down. Many leaves scattered in different directions. One of the men pulled a sword forward, the others had bows, staves, and various weapons. A huge explosion screamed across the clearing, sending several stones flying to the side. Kai ran forward, he looked back, his hair fluttering in the wind, as did his clothes. He thought, he barely calculated. Streams of wind surrounded him. A huge monkey with burning eyes stretched his paw forward trying to grab Kai. Kai thought that the elite giant monkey was much stronger than the ordinary ones, he should be careful. Heavy steps echoed on the ground. Suddenly Kai began to turn around and thought, but he is also far from simple. He jumped, many blades with red lightning rushing forward. Kai lowered his head down and struck the giant monkey with a dozen blades. He roared in pain, opened his mouth and eyes wide. One of the blades hit him in the forehead, others went along his body with red pillars of energy. Kai began to jump backwards. The monkey continued to run and suddenly it was struck by a huge lightning bolt. An explosion spread across the clearing, the monkey's entire body turned red. Kai stopped and watched it. The information sign said that the elite monkey giant was the 15th level of the slain. Kai stood on the corpse, a smile shining on his face, and he thought, beauty, he didn't think he could take this down with just one critical hit. The monkey lay belly down, the monkey's eyes no longer burned, they were enveloped in the wind. Kai's face became confident, his eyes sparkled in the sun, he thought proudly, for the sake of the chest he could try. At the same time, many people were dodging other giant monkeys. One of the guys created a blue shield around himself. The healer treated the wounded soldiers. The monkeys swung their paws in all directions, the people twisted around and could not make a normal attack. The captain shouted at them to work harder. They still have to share the reward. Kai appeared from behind a small rock, the captain clenched his teeth and held tightly to his sword, shrouded in golden flames. Suddenly a blow landed on him, he screamed in pain and flew to the side. Quiet steps were heard. Kai entered a dark cave, which was shrouded in twilight, and saw a shiny chest. He was delighted, opened his mouth and thought happily, it's so easy to get to this. The chest is right there. Looks like a big sum awaits him. This is wonderful. It was clearly worth the risk of killing a level 15 monkey. Kai began to move closer to the chest through the vines. He smiled brightly and with one hand began to reach for the chest, which was illuminated. Suddenly he heard a huge roar, something dripped and spread over his shoulder. Kai was scared, his face remained dark and his pupils shrank. A huge giant monkey with crazy eyes and human teeth loomed over Kai. Suddenly the monkey struck a huge blow to the ground. Kai jumped back. The monkey struck again, fear appeared on Kai's face and he thought, what? So this is a level 20 elite monkey giant. They didn't warn about this, monster, The strongest elite giant monkey, level 20. Score is dangerous. The monkey's face was crazy, its pupils were strangely shaped. A human smile glittered there. The eyes of this creature were brightly shining. It was larger than the other monkeys, leaning on 4 paws and looking at Kai, blocking the passage from the cave. Leaned on 4 paws and looked at Kai, blocking the passage from the cave. Kai thought, was it hidden here on purpose? Suddenly he threw several blades, which flew forward with lightning. The monkey smiled and stood motionless. Kai thought he would have to fight. The monkey knocked off the blade. One flew into the eye and also bounced off. Kai was scared. He pushed away. Fear showed on his face. He wondered if the blow to the eye had any effect. The information board showed that the strongest elite monkey is a giant, 23 defense points, and he cannot cause damage so easily. The monkey opened its mouth and stuck out its tongue. The monkey's eyes lit up. A heavy atmosphere enveloped them. Kai wrinkled his eyebrows. His eyebrows knitted into his eyes, and he thought that he was only able to remove 9 points of protection, but that's only 23. So, he needs to remove the protection first, and then take on the main life? Everything is like the Wolf Lords. The giant monkey began to raise its paw for another blow. The wind rose in the cave. Kai did not react. He didn't have time to do anything. The monkey carried the blow. The red wave passed by and Kai flew into the wall with a roar. He destroyed the wall behind him. His clothes were tattered. There was blood on his face, and he was coughing and choking in pain. Blood flowed down his head and face. His eyes began to close and he thought how painful it was. The attributes weren't enough. He started feeling dizzy and thought, he's not going to die, is he? Death on the Devil's Star will not be in vain. You will have to wait a whole month to go here again. The giant monkey grabbed Kai, squeezed him tightly in his hand and lifted him higher. The monkey smiled evilly. Drool flowed from his mouth and did not take his eyes off Kai, squeezing him harder. Kai thought if that was the case, he shouldn't have come here. So he needs to join the army to help his brother and sister? His face was covered in bruises. His eyes began to close. Consciousness began to leave him. He said how hard it is for him now. Suddenly he heard someone's voice telling him to wake up. Several pairs of legs ran among the smoke and dirt. His brother carried him and told him to wake up. Kai was completely covered in blood, his clothes were tattered, and he had many wounds. The men ran forward and told him not to fall asleep. He must try not to sleep. The men fled through the destruction, and were all battered with wounds and abrasions. He shouted that he would definitely pull him out of the battlefield. Kai was half-conscious, his pupils were not visible, his eyes were empty, and he put his hand on his stomach. His knees were completely wiped with blood. Huge flying creatures and other monsters surrounded the city. All that was left of the buildings were boxes. Monsters were screaming and attacking people. Several more people were running through the same ruins as her brother and Kai. The city was engulfed in chaos and horror. 10 years ago, the battlefield of gods and beasts. Kai thought that how could he fall asleep? He lowered his head and continued to be in the monkey's hand. The monkey began to raise his hand and bring it to his mouth. He had many wounds. Kai thought that his older brother had pulled him and his sister out of the battlefield. Could he die here? Suddenly he put his hand to his side and threw a blade, which flew towards it with black lightning. His body came to life, his eyes acquired a confident shine. He clenched his teeth, continued to be bleeding, a red aura engulfed him. Suddenly the monkey swallowed him. He raised his head to the sky, still holding his hand near his mouth and leaning on the other. His face became crazy, his eyes stopped glowing and he smiled. Suddenly the monkey felt something and a huge burst of energy and light appeared through his eyes, blinding him. Suddenly the monkey's head exploded, a huge amount of blood gushing out in all directions. The monkey began to fall and landed with a loud bang. Level 20 elite monkey giant killed. Kai sat on the floor, leaning on his knee and hand. His clothes were shabby, he was steaming, and he thought he had succeeded. Despite the fact that the external defense of the monkey is high, the insides and oral cavity are very weak. If you attack from the inside, the monkey will not be able to defend itself. Just like with the Lord of the Twilight Wolves. Kai began to gradually lift his hand off the ground, standing up. The light illuminated the treasure chest, which was shrouded in vines. Kai unsurely turned in that direction and thought, the elite treasure chest is now his. He smiled and looked at it. He was tired. Half an hour later, a huge giant monkey with many abrasions and thorns through its body fell to the ground. There was a lot of smoke around. Someone shouted, "Victory!" One of the team members raised his weapon and shouted, "Good thing the guy took one away." The other one replied, "He must be dead already." All the team members were battered, some were standing on the corpses of monkeys. They lay motionless. The leader smiled, looked at his team, blood flowed from his mouth, and said if he died, they would receive more rewards. Overall, it's not that bad. A huge team began to make their way to the entrance to the cave. The sun illuminated their shadows and they said, "Go ahead, their chest has already been waiting for them. They will soon be rich." Suddenly the leader's eyes opened wide, his pupils constricted, and he looked forward in surprise. An empty cave appeared before him, the chest was no longer in place. The team looked ahead with all their eyes. The leader shouted angrily, "What's the matter? Where's the chest? Isn't there an elite chest here?" His hands and face were bruised, and his veins were standing out from anger. His eyebrows knitted together, and several wrinkles covered his face. One of the team members raised his hand and said uncertainly, "It seems that guy came into the cave during the battle." The leader turned around and angrily shouted, "What? Why didn't anyone tell him about this before?" A young guy with an abrasion on his face was frightened and said with a stutter, it seemed to him that he could survive. The other team members shouted, "What?" They were all unhappy and looked ahead. And one of the guys asked, "It turns out they fought in vain? A few days without removal work." The other one pulled his hand forward and said angrily, "Even if there is no chest, they should still get at least some kind of reward." The third said with dissatisfaction that they should have been paid for several months already. The captain stood and looked forward. His face burst into anger and he shouted with rage, "It turns out that some boy had deceived them? It shouldn't stay like this." The Valley of the Ruler, the other side. A small blue beautiful river passed through a huge forest. Kai walked ahead, there was an information sign in front of him. He said without them he wouldn't have gotten the chest. Well, he can see what's new. The chest materialized on the stone. It lit up and a lot of little blue information signs appeared from it. Kai's eyes began to reflect light, the chest opened and there were many precious stones. The chest glistened in the light of the sun. Dollars appeared in Kai's eyes and he shouted with a smile, "Cool! So much ore! There's still equipment." He held in his hands red stones that fell down. Kai smiled, he looked down contentedly and stretched out his hand to take out his cloak. He thought, the value of the Devil Star equipment is quite high, now he is rich. Suddenly something caught his attention, he looked to the side and thought, more equipment? He saw gloves with flames painted on them. He began to put it on, the red stones were illuminated from behind, he put on the equipment. Kai adjusted his gloves, the fingers were trimmed in red, the icon on the top of the gloves showed flames. Kai looked at himself carefully and thought, these gloves? And how can this help him? Now he'll look. Suddenly they glowed, a yellow flame enveloped him, lifting his hair upward. He was very surprised, opened his mouth and thought he felt much better. Maybe the equipment increases agility and strength. Now he will try to attack. He took his blade in his hands, spread his arms to the sides and looked forward. A lot of grass and greenery opened before him. He threw several spikes forward. They rushed forward. He spread his legs wide. The spikes were painted with yellow flame and flew forward. Kai thought, looking away from this and thought, tongues of flame appeared on the thorns. So this adds flame to any weapon? There are many types of flames on the Devil Star that cause different damage. He imagined a huge purple demon, one of the flames was yellow and had lightning. The other looked like a purple whirlwind, the third looked like ordinary fire. Kai continued to think, the damage from a simple flame is extremely small, it can hardly be used for an attack, most likely for cooking. He imagined a demon whose tail was on fire and who asked, is this a simple flame? Did they want to fry him? Kai was upset, looked down, despondency was reflected on his face and he thought, will this really be needed only for cooking a barbecue? He began to examine his gloves, suddenly he heard a huge roar among the forests. He threw his head down and got scared, he thought, sounds. Suddenly huge monkey paws rushed to the ground. Elite monkey giant level 18. Score is dangerous. A huge monkey with glowing yellow eyes appeared before him. Kai stood in a fighting pose and thought, 4 elite monsters at once. The monkeys approached him with open mouths. He jumped back, holding his hand on the ground, he raised his other hand back and thought, is this all because of the attack of the gloves? Literally just now he could barely cope with one monkey, and now there are 4 of them at once. He threw his hand forward, the blades flew with red, yellow and black lightning. His face was angry, his teeth were clenched. The blades fell into the monkey's mouth, he thought, he can only focus on attacking one at a time. The monkeys roared in pain, and the blades hit her teeth, which made her smile. The eyes continued to glow purple. An information sign appeared and said that it was impossible to break through the defense. The damage done is 0. Kai got scared, sweat ran down his face, and he thought, this is very bad. It turns out they know they need to protect their mouths. 4 monkeys rushed at him with a roar and roar. They broke the ground under their feet. The monkeys leaned on their hands. The burning blade struck one of the monkeys in the heart. Kai ran away with greater speed. He didn't turn around and thought, even if they run with their mouths open, he won't be able to kill it so easily. Is he really going to die today? The flames begin to spread across the monkey, showing that it deals -10 health. The flames also began to spread on the other monkeys, the flames causing damage to them. Kai began to turn around and thought doubtfully, does this flame work? The monkey flared up more and more. Each of these flashes caused 10 units of damage. Suddenly the monkey flared up more and more. Its eye opened wide and one of the monkeys flared up, receiving -2000 health damage. The other monkey screamed and moved back. The monkey's mouth was open, causing flames to come out. The fire flared up even stronger. 3 signs showed -2000 health damage. The other monkey stood and looked at this in shock. Flames were flying around them. Kai got scared, opened his mouth and clenched his fist. He thought in horror, is the fire so strong? The monkey continued to burn, but there was a fiery splash on its forehead. Its eyes were not visible. The teeth were clenched as the fire spread throughout the body. He began to look at himself, flames coming from his hand. Another monkey also caught fire. Several signs showed -2000 health damage. All 3 monkeys burst into flames and the explosion echoed throughout the entire area. The wind rose strongly. Kai grouped himself a little and shouted, why did the monkeys suddenly die? He stuck to the ground, put his hand down, and jumped back and looked at the 3 corpses of monkeys. Steam and smoke came from them. They lay defeated in the middle of a large clearing. The information sign said 4 elite giant monkeys were dead. Kai stood amazed and looked at it all and said, by the way, the damage from the flame was only 10? How did it increase to 2000? He remembered the burning monkey that flew forward towards him. 4 information signs with monkey corpses appeared in front of him. It glowed blue and he asked, has it become 200 times larger? He looked at his glove which glittered in the sun. He smiled an insidious smile and said, it means that the flame from the gloves is not so simple. Not only does the damage increase 200 times, it also increases the power of a critical hit. In addition, is there also team damage? He looked at the gloves and remembered how the monkeys exploded. Flames enveloped them and the explosion spread across the entire area. He said, it turns out that the flame does not touch the monster's defense, killing it from the inside and he can get up to 2000 points per second. Fire transformation. This is great gear. And the damage is good. He imagined himself surrounded by flames, his eyes burning, and his arms spread to the side. A fiery whirlwind began to appear from above it. Kai smiled and said, now there is no reason to worry. He can always break through the defense. Thus, that night, all the giant monkeys from the ruler's valley became victims of real genocide. The forest was burning with a huge bright flame. The trees were blown away by the wind. Explosions were heard across the ground. Screams of pain were heard everywhere. The giant monkeys turned to each other and did not understand what was happening. They were surrounded by flames. They had never seen a common man kill it with ordinary flames. The moon turned red, illuminating the forest that was burning. The giant monkeys panicked and rushed back from the forest without getting into fights. It saw nothing but blood. And Kai came down among the flames, waving his arms. Near him lay many corpses of monkeys. It felt like there was a demon at work in the valley. Kai smiled evilly, closed his eyes, laughed, and said that everything within a 10-mile radius had been cleared. The next day, in the ruler's valley, a lot of smoke was coming through the valley. The land was empty. Kai showed 2 fingers on his hand and said with a smile, great. In just one evening he killed a dozen giant monkeys. He was also able to increase his level. The information board showed Traveler Kai, Profession Gambler, level 7. Characteristics: Strength 28, Constitution 32, Agility 48, Fortitude 48, Defense 0, Critical Hit Chance 0.1%, Critical Hit 20,000%, Experience 85 out of 6,400. Kai looked at the sign and smiled, then he turned his attention to his red dagger which sparkled in the sun. He squeezed it harder in his hand and thought, now the damage from the gloves has become much higher. He thinks that at level 20 he will be completely invincible. In front of him were many information signs with corpses of monkeys and different types of chests. The wind enveloped them. Kai, now he has 10 elite treasure chests and pictures of giant monkey corpses. He can sell it all for a lot of money. Suddenly something caught his attention, he thought, and pursed his lips. He stood on a vast plain, the wind surrounding him whipped his hair. He thought, even somehow it's lonely here, he misses those times when he fought with Zhu and Su. I wonder how they are doing with the military. The sun illuminated the green mountains. Kai continued to think, he thinks that their affairs are much better than his. To the other side of the ruler's valley. Zhu clenched his fists and roared, what kind of place is this? Why is there no one? Where have all the monkeys gone? Zhu fell cowering, his body was shaking and he screamed, why did he come here? For several days not a single monkey has been seen. Who killed them? Su pressed her hands to her chest, closed her eyes and said how Kai lacks efficiency. Suddenly Biao drew their attention to him, telling them to stop chatting. They are soldiers. Su and Zhu turned around sharply. Biao said that earlier it was easier for them to deal with the monsters because they were in the beginner zone. Now everything has changed. Player Li Biao, Profession Horseman, level 38. The man stood with an angry expression on his face. His face was frowning and his gaze was firm. He continued to say, if Kai had brought them here, nothing would have changed anyway. He specifically brought them to the ruler's valley so that they could become independent. They should stop whining. Let them continue their search for the giant monkeys. Zhu stood up abruptly, wrinkled his forehead and said that's right. Su repeated the same thing, pressing her fist to her heart. They practically cried and thought that they both still missed Kai. 3 days later. A waterfall came down from the mountains. Teams of several people stood near a large number of corpses of giant monkeys. Dust came from them. One of the guys laughed and said, who would have thought that after spending so much time in the ruler's valley, they would only stumble upon ordinary giant monkeys. Moreover, there were no problems with them. They are too weak. The other guy laughed, pointed at himself and said with a smile that he thought killing Kai would go much easier. The swordsman shouted, dirt reflected on his face and he said, killing a man and a beast are completely different things. Others turned their attention to him, their faces were angry and dissatisfied. The archer showed his finger up and was happy. The girl looked at them and continued to say that a few days ago they saw how one deity single-handedly killed 3 monkeys. The archer raised her finger up and said, that's for sure. It was cool. The warrior mages stood nearby. They were all sitting around the fire. Suddenly the first guy said with a grin that he killed 3. This must be cool for low-level players, right? He shook his head, madness showing on his face. The swordsman continued to grin. He closed his eyes. The first guy asked loudly if they had seen this man. He showed Kai's portrait on his watch using an information sign. The swordsman drew attention to this, continuing to chew. They said that it just so happened that this was the very deity who alone was able to kill several monkeys at once. A sparkle lit up in the archer's eyes. He approached with a smile and said, he's handsome. The guy raised his hand up. One of the warrior's colleagues crossed his arms over his chest and said, they must be mistaken. Let him take a closer look, this is just a level 5 beginner. The first guy laughed, closed one eye and arrogantly told them not to talk nonsense. The swordsman threw the core of the purple apple onto the ground, began to walk away and turned around saying, if they don't believe them, then let them check for themselves. They saw him emerging from the valley of the ruler. The healer grabbed his face with his hands and said with hearts in his eyes that he even had a chance to say hello to him. The other team started to leave with smiles. The first guy shouted, what? Are they saying that Kai is somewhere nearby? His eyes glowed red, a crazy smile painted his face, and he pulled the bloody sword out of the monkey's corpse. Another guy with red eyes told them all to go ahead, it's time to carry out their mission. All team members' eyes lit up red. They smiled evilly. The swordsman said that the time had finally come to finish him off. The other team looked at it strangely, they didn't believe it. The archer asked, are they going to find the deity? The healer said that the deity looked very strong, and she would not be surprised if they were hunted. The swordsman said it right. At the same time, the crowded exit from the ruler's valley. Many tents stood on the plain. Crowds of people walked back and forth. Someone said, what's wrong with these monkeys? Where did the rest go? Another guy approached him, there were tattoos on his face, and he replied that they also didn't really have time to do anything, they were all killed. Kai walked through the crowd with a smile and looked at the information board. At this time, the cause of all troubles passed. Kai thought that in these 3 days he had killed several more giant monkeys, and even managed to rise to the 10th level. In addition, he received 19 elite treasure chests. He thinks it's time to return to the city and sell everything. As reported by the information board, Traveler Kai, Profession Gambler, Level 10. Characteristics: Strength 40, Constitution 44, Agility 66, Fortitude 66, Defense 0, Critical Hit Chance, 0.1%, Critical Hit, 20,000%, Experience 332 out of 12,800. Suddenly someone shouted for Kai to stop. Out of misunderstanding, he began to turn back and saw the Falcon team. Their eyes were highlighted in red. The swordsman pointed at him with a crazy smile and said that he had been sitting with his head hidden for too long. It took them a long time to find it. He laughed evilly. There were abrasions on his face. Someone from the crowd shouted, "Isn't this the Huang family's 5th hunting team?" Others asked why they were interested in this guy. There was surprise on the faces of the entire crowd. Kai looked at them seriously, bowed his head and asked, "Huang family? From the guild? So they were sent by the Huang family?" The swordsman began to take out his sword. It glinted in the sun from its sheath. He asked if it was out of fear. Is he asking such obvious things? He simply provoked the Huang family. So he will pay for this with his life. The entire team lit up with different colors and lightning as they pulled out their weapons. The wind rose too strong. Kai turned towards them and stood with his arms outstretched to the side. It was engulfed in a bright flame. He jumped back, ducked and shouted, "He just overtook one. Are they sure it's worth it?" The swordsman jumped up and shouted. He didn't care which one was right. The healer with a smile and veins on her forehead ran forward with blades and asked, "Does he even know how much they will pay for him?" Kai bowed his head back. His gaze became serious. He moved his hand with the fiery blades back. "They say that since they value everything in money, let them not blame him." He jumped, his hair flying back, a huge wave of blades rushing straight ahead. People started to shy away from it. They all clenched their teeth. The swordsman with a small fire on his chest jumped up and shouted, "This is funny. Does he think some pathetic flame will stop them?" The healer also had fire on her shoulder. She asked if Juan really died at the hands of the scum. She had a sword in her hands and was rushing straight at him. Kai jumped back and the girl landed on the ground. Someone from the crowd shouted, "What a banality. His flame is too low." The other guy laughed and said he thinks Kai will be stronger. "They look like they're being given a light." Kai laughed. His eyes began to shine in the sun and he asked if they were laughing. Now he will see how his current damage is to them. After all, nothing will bother them if the damage from the flame becomes a little stronger. Suddenly the swordsman began to notice that at first 10 units of damage were removed from him. The next blow was minus 2,000 damage units. He did not understand what had happened and kept looking at the fire spreading on him. Suddenly he flared up with all his might, screamed in pain, and a huge explosion rolled across the clearing. The other team members were shocked. They shouted, "Captain?" Their faces were sweating a lot. They opened their mouths and began to look around themselves. The captain shouted in the fire, "What's the matter?" 2,000 damage units were removed from it. He asked why the damage became so bad. People started looking at little fiery flashes on their bodies. They were horrified and opened their mouths. Suddenly, the other team members also burst into large, bright flashes. They all roared in pain and began to lose 2,000 points of damage. The girl shouted, "What's wrong with her?" The other guy told her that there was something wrong with him too. There was horror and lack of understanding of what was happening on their faces. Huge waves of flame continued to spread to other people, and an explosion rippled across the clearing. The information sign said Traveler Kai is killing a team of 5 and stealing the team members' experience. The man stood up and shouted, "What's going on?" All the people did not stop watching them while the flames stopped working. Kai moved his hand to the side, lowered his head down and said, "Okay, if they were in a hurry to find him, he would accept their attention." He stood near the charred bodies. The fire continued to flare up next to him. His face was confident. Someone from the crowd grabbed his head with his hands and shouted in horror, what was happening? Did he single-handedly take out an entire team? The other guy said nervously, "This is a level 20 elite." The young boy shouted, if he had not seen with his own eyes how people were killed with ordinary flames, he would not have believed it in his life. Kai bent down and began to pull his blade out of the ground. Someone from the crowd asked who he was. The information plate showed the activation of accrued experience. One of the guys in the crowd asked why he couldn't see his stats. His information plate showed level 12. The characteristic was not available to him. Information about this was blocked by users. The guy asked how so? Why is it not visible? Suddenly his eyes widened and he said that he understood. Is this the god of flame, setting fire to equipment in his path to kill everyone around him? They remembered Kai surrounded by flames. Other people asked, God of flame? Exactly. He really is the god of flame. Kai stood without a single scratch. He smiled and looked at his characteristics, saying that this was great. He increased it by 2 more levels. Suddenly a girl appeared next to him. He asked why others don't see his characteristics. The system replied that it was all thanks to his profession as a gambler. At his level, there should be completely different characteristics, and since they are so different, it may come as a shock to others. Therefore, his indicators are not visible to anyone. The girl looked at him calmly. Kai looked back and asked again, right? It's good that no one sees anything. They will be less jealous. He looked at the crowd, which saw him off with open mouths. Devil Star, Xingyao's city, exchange shop. A sign on the store showed gold scales. Kai said hello and said that he wanted to sell his equipment. The girl behind the counter laid down on the counter. She told him, welcome, and closed her eyes. Kai thought, is it really possible that no one comes in at all? The place here is not the best. Kai extended his hand forward. A lot of information cards appeared in front of him. He said with a smile, there aren't that many things, so let her count it already. The girl moved away from the counter. Her eyes expressed boredom and she said that she would now see what she could offer him. Suddenly her gaze widened and she saw many elite-level giant monkeys. Kai darkened and said, here are several corpses of giant monkeys. He smiled and pulled his hand back, saying, there are also 19 elite treasure chests here. He spread his arms in different directions, and many different signs appeared in front of the girl, who was in horror and shock. Kai looked out from behind it with a smile and asked, does she see him? He would like to know how much he can get for it. The girl's eyes widened, she became nervous and sweat ran down her face. Her body was shaking and she thought, is this a professional hunter? Where does he get so many things from? She shook her head, then perked up, clenched her hand into a fist and firmly said that he should not worry. It just so happened that in front of him is the most important seller. She will calculate everything today. She thought that she should get this client by any means possible. Kai apologized for disturbing him. The calculator on the table showed a large number. The girl sighed heavily, looked at the paper and said that corpse cards could be sold for 10,000, and chests for 170,000. In total, he would receive 180,000. Kai smiled, presented mountains of coins and asked, 180,000 Devil Star coins? He thought that the Devil Star coins were equal to 10 Xingyao coins. 1 Devil Star coin can be exchanged for 10 city coins. He received only 180,000 coins. He will be able to cover all medical expenses. He walked contentedly among the crowd, closing his eyes with smiles on his face. He shouted that we can assume that he has already fulfilled the bet. Not only will he not have to go into the army, but he will also be able to pay for hospitalization expenses. Suddenly the voice of a fortune teller was heard from behind, telling him to wait. She told him fortunes last time. Kai was surprised and turned back. The fortune teller was out of breath, leaned on her knee and tried to catch her breath from running. She said that she then advised him to go to the ruler's valley. Is not it? She thinks he got himself into trouble there. Kai smiled, put his hands in his pocket, and said that the trip to the valley had helped him a lot. He was grateful for her advice. Yen pointed her finger up and asked with a smile, then can he help her fulfill her request? Kai replied, okay, she can talk. The girl smiled and nervously said if he could take her with him to his team. They will fight side by side. Her eyes sparkled and a blush covered her face, and she put her hand on her chest. Kai darkened, turned around and said goodbye to her. Yen screamed, where is he going? He's really leaving. Her heart practically jumped out of her chest. She looked down and calmly said, yes, even the military assesses her profession as the most useless. She shouldn't have expected anything else. Suddenly she shouted, maybe he will listen to her. She knows he's interested in equipment. Does he want to take her equipment? She will give it for free. This is the last time she visits the Devil's Star anyway. Kai turned around and looked at her with interest. He asked, is this the last time? Is she poor too? Does she really want to switch off forever? Doesn't she want to try to make money? They stood in the middle of the city, where a large fountain flowed. The girl turned her gaze to the side and unfortunately said yes, she still won't be able to make money. In the end, no one needs such a profession. When the military decided that a feng shui master was an important profession, she managed to reach level 20, and then she retrained as a fortune teller. But the initial abilities of a feng shui master lay in a more acute perception of place and time. After acquiring the profession of a fortune teller, she can only predict fate. She remembered the men who hovered above the circle with blue runes. Her clothes and hair went in different directions. Yen stood between the other students, lowered her head and continued. When the military realized that the fortune tellers had no combat skills, they decided to abandon them. Since they are weak, no one wants to accept them into the team, so they failed to advance. And no one takes her to fight monsters, although she comes here every day. She stood on the counters, with many gold coins, and looked in different directions at the travelers. If she returns to Earth, that is, she can earn money as a laborer at a construction site, and at least receive some money. She imagined herself as a handyman with a helmet on her head and a huge bag in her hands, which was hard for her to drag. Kai thought and said, yes, it's already hard for her, he understands that. He is also not a rich man, he always has to worry about his brother's health and pay for medical expenses. The girl bent down and sadly said that she understood this. She smiled, closed her eyes and said that she also had a brother and sister on Earth, so she couldn't give up. And she thought, okay, she will fight. Kai remembered his older brother, he was covered in bruises, stood and smiled. Kai thought and remembered the picture of how his brother went to a construction site, leaving him with his little sister at home. He thinks she looks like his brother. He also strived to develop on the Devil Star, giving his all for the sake of the common future. But after the responsibility for them fell on him, he decided to give up his dream. He was carrying huge loads, it was hard for him, his body was wounded and bruised, he thought, as soon as his body reached its limit. Yen turned around, crossed her arms and walked forward, saying okay, does he still need her equipment? Now she'll get it. In any case, someday it will come to return to normal life. And she was already saying goodbye to him. Kai said let her wait. Next time. The fortune teller returned and looked at him with her mouth open. Kai turned around with a smile and said that his name was Kai, now he would pass out, but later. If they meet again on the internet, let them create a team. He was sure that the girl was in shock, blushed deeply and opened her mouth. She pressed her hand to her chest and her legs began to shake and she asked, really? Kai walked off into the distance, waving his hand, saying, yes, if he doesn't, then he won't be able to earn another penny. Yen cried, wiping her tears with her hands. She was happy, saying that he was very worried about money, so he didn't swear by it. And she suddenly flew at Kai, hugging him from behind, saying that he was a wonderful person. Kai choked and leaned forward. He began to brush her off by putting his hand forward. He shouted what she was doing. Yen said that she was saying nice words to him. People began to turn to look at them.